The man known to history as Oswald Mosley was born on the 16th of November 1896 on Hill Street in Mayfair in London. His father was Sir Oswald Mosley, 5th Baronet Mosley. The baronetage had been introduced in Britain in the 17th century as a rank of minor nobility. The Mosleys were a lower-ranking scion of the British aristocracy with considerable financial independence. The Mosleys trace their lineage all the way back to the 12th century and the early stages of Norman rule in England. Sir Oswald served for a time in the military during Oswald Jr.'s youth, notably in Egypt, a British protectorate which had been effectively conquered in 1882 to secure Britain's interest in the Suez Canal and the sea route it provided to British India. Young Oswald's mother was Catherine Maud Edwards Heathcote, also a member of the British minor nobility with strong familial ties to the military. The family was also extremely wealthy. A near ancestor, Sir John Heathcote, having emerged as a major business figure in Staffordshire in the late 18th century in the early stages of the Industrial Revolution. Oswald was the first of Catherine and Oswald Sr.'s 3 children. They had 2 further sons, Edward and John Arthur, born respectively in 1899 and 1901. Oswald's youth was a troubled one in some significant ways. Though he clearly benefited from growing up as a member of a wealthy aristocratic family, his parents' marriage was not a happy one, and as the eldest of their 3 children, he was inevitably front and center in dealing with their marital problems. The conflicts between Oswald Sr. and Catherine usually focused on his adultery and overbearing nature, bordering on physical aggression. Eventually, Oswald's parents separated in all but name. Meanwhile, Oswald Jr., who was known primarily to family members in his youth as Tom, to distinguish him from his father and his grandfather, who was also called Oswald, was sent to live with his grandparents at Apedale Hall in Staffordshire, a large country estate. There, he was apparently spoiled by his grandparents for several years before being sent to West Downs Preparatory School and then on to Winchester College, an elite school which had been originally set up in the 14th century and which acted as a feeder college to Oxford University in a time when one's class dictated their educational aspirations in Britain. At Winchester, Mosley excelled in several sports, becoming both a boxer and a fencer. His proficiency in the latter was notable, and had he been born in a different age and to a different social background, he might well have ended up as a professional fencer. When he was just 16, Mosley left Winchester. Unlike others, he didn't head for Oxford, but rather for the Royal Military College at Sandhurst. In the 19th century, the sons of the British royal family had begun serving in the British Royal Navy and Armed Forces, and it soon became a well-established tradition that sons of the nobility should serve in the military or navy for some period of time in order to further the interests of Britain's extensive empire. Following in this tradition, Oswald arrived in Sandhurst in 1913. By that time, he had already developed a reputation as having a quarrelsome personality, regularly getting drunk and picking fights when out and about Sandhurst. In the early summer of 1914, he was expelled from the military college for his behavior after he participated in a brawl in which he fractured his right ankle. Luckily for Mosley, within weeks, Europe rapidly marched towards the First World War after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in Sarajevo in late June. Due to this, he was accepted back into the military and was commissioned into the 16th, the Queen's Lancers, a cavalry unit, as British forces prepared to head to France, where a large proportion of the most intense fighting would play out on the Western Front over the next 4 years. Early in the war, both sides had grasped the potential of aerial warfare. The first plane had only been successfully flown in late 1903 by the Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk in North Carolina, but immediately upon the outbreak of the conflict in the late summer of 1914, the British, French, Germans and others realized the potential of aircraft, first for flying reconnaissance missions, and then as devices to break the military deadlock on the ground. Mosley quickly became interested in joining the incipient British Royal Flying Corps and began training as a pilot. His fleeting career in the Air Force proved disastrous. He quickly completed his pilot's training. Then, in May 1915, while demonstrating his flying abilities in front of his mother at Shoreham, he crashed his plane. The impact shattered his right ankle, which had only recently healed from the fracture caused during the riot that he was involved in at Sandhurst a year earlier. The double injury to his ankle exacerbated the wound and made it unlikely it would heal 100%. Then, to compound matters, he headed back to France to fight in the trenches before it was fully healed. After re-exacerbating the wound again, he was informed that if he didn't head back to England to convalesce, there was a possibility of amputation. Mosley followed doctor's orders when so informed in 1916, but his ankle never fully recovered, and for the rest of his life he walked with a slight limp. Mosley saw active service at the Battle of Loos on the Western Front in France in the autumn of 1915, where he passed out from the pain in his leg, but his return to England early the next year left him effectively confined to administrative duty at the Foreign Office and in the Ministry of Munitions for the rest of the First World War. Nevertheless, his eagerness to serve in France and the fact that it had left him with a permanent injury had gained him some respect in political and aristocratic circles. As the war came to an end, he was consequently contacted by senior figures in the Conservative Party with an eye towards contesting the 1918 general election. He was duly elected for the constituency of Harrow, where he won easy election in an uncompetitive race. Thus, just weeks after turning 22, he entered the British Parliament as its youngest member. He began to make his mark there based on his oratorical abilities, his speech delivery being far better than most of the other members of the House. He served as the representative for Harrow for the next 6 years, gaining re-election in 1922. These were also important years in Mosley's personal life. In the late 1910s, he began a relationship with Cynthia Blanche Curzon, a daughter of George Curzon, 1st Marquis of Kedleston, and Earl Curzon. Curzon had served as a Viceroy of British India between 1899 and 1905, as head of the burgeoning Air Board for a time during the war, and finally emerged as Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs in 1919. He would become leader of the House of Lords in the mid-1920s and was both wealthy and powerful. He suspected Mosley wanted to marry his daughter for her wealth and social status, but he nevertheless gave the union his blessing, and Oswald and Cynthia were married in May 1920. A daughter and a son, Vivian and Nicholas, followed in the first years of the marriage, and belatedly a third child, Michael, was born after a long gap in 1932. Other than this veneer of family stability, their marriage was a chaotic one, in which Oswald unleashed chaos amongst the Curzons. He engaged in an affair with Cynthia's younger sister Alexandra for a time, and also Grace Curzon, Cynthia's stepmother, who had married Lord Curzon in 1917, his first wife, Cynthia's mother, having died many years earlier. There were other affairs Mosley engaged in, but these ones with his wife's sister and stepmother were clearly of a level of moral dubiousness that was unusual. Despite the peculiar nature of their marriage, Cynthia and Oswald shared many similar political views, and she appears to have even influenced him substantially in the 1920s. She was a supporter of the labor movement, and later in the 1920s even became a supporter of Leon Trotsky, the powerful member of the Soviet Union government who eventually fled from Russia after a power struggle with Joseph Stalin. Oswald too ended up drifting to the left politically in the 1920s. In 1922, he crossed the floor, a well-known euphemism for when someone changed political parties in the British Parliament to join a rival party. Historically, crossing the floor was associated with individuals moving between the Conservatives and the Liberals, the two dominant parties during the 19th century, but in the post-war period, Labour had outflanked the Liberals to become the major rivals of the Conservatives. When Oswald absconded from the Conservatives in 1922, he initially sat as an independent, but in 1924 he eventually joined Labour. His principal motive in doing so was opposition to the manner in which the British government had handled the Irish War of Independence, fought between 1919 and 1921, particularly the use of the notorious Black and Tan irregulars, and the atrocities they committed against the civilian population in Ireland. More broadly, Mosley's views on economic policy were drifting left of the Conservatives in the 1920s, and Labour, at least for a time, seemed like a good home for his revised political stance. Mosley's decision to cross the floor led to a temporary hiatus in his political career. In October 1924, the first ever Labour government, a minority administration led by Ramsay MacDonald, collapsed after less than a year. In the election, which was held at the end of October, Mosley was put forward to run in the Ladywood constituency in Birmingham, something of a Chamberlain family's stronghold that supported the Conservatives. Labour lost the wider election nationally by a large margin, primarily because the Liberal vote collapsed and transferred to the Conservatives. But in Ladywood, Mosley came very close to unseating Chamberlain, a future British Prime Minister. In fact, he may have actually done so. On the first count, Chamberlain was apparently elected by just 7 votes. Mosley understandably demanded a recount. On the second effort, Mosley emerged as the victor by a margin of 2 votes. Eventually, on the final count, Chamberlain's vote appeared to suddenly jump by nearly 100 votes, and he won by a majority of 77. Mosley's political career was briefly on hiatus, though he had given Chamberlain such a scare that in the next election he switched to the safer seat of Edgbaston. With his parliamentary career temporarily at an end, Mosley and Cynthia went travelling. In the 1920s, they visited various parts of Europe and the British Empire, notably India, where Cynthia had spent some of her earliest years when her father was viceroy there, and where the Curzons were well respected. There, Mosley met with Mahatma Gandhi, the leader of the Indian independence movement. It is an indication of the contradictions which characterized Mosley that he could, despite displaying a clear streak of virulent anti-Semitism and racism in other respects in later years, demonstrate his respect for Gandhi after meeting him in the 1920s, while the Indian political leader, for his part, also stated that Mosley had made a favorable impression on him. Meanwhile, as he was out of Parliament in the mid-1920s, Mosley kept an eye on developments at Westminster, and the Labour Party was anxious to have a skilled orator representing them again in Parliament. Therefore, When the Smethwick seat in Staffordshire fell vacant in 1926, Mosley was an obvious candidate to stand in his mother's native region. He won the campaign that December, and so, after a hiatus of 2 years, returned to Westminster. 2 years later, he would also ascend to the minor nobility as he succeeded as 6th Baronet Mosley on the death of his father. Over the next several years, Mosley steered his way towards a senior position within the Labour shadow cabinet, while the Conservatives governed for nearly a 5-year period following their earlier victory in the 1924 election. It was not until an election was held in May 1929, nicknamed the Flapper election, owing to it being the first British election in which women in their 20s were allowed to vote, that the political situation changed. Although the Wall Street crash would not occur for several months yet, the election was fought against a backdrop of some early economic warning signs and rising unemployment in Britain, factors which saw Labour make extensive gains over the Conservatives and returned MacDonald to 10 Downing Street as Prime Minister of a new minority government. Mosley had hoped for a senior cabinet appointment, but had to make do with the lesser position of Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, an office which centres on administration of the royal estate. MacDonald did not wish to alienate a figure who he viewed as full of promise and who many in political circles in the 1920s viewed as a potential leader of Labour and future Prime Minister. Hence, MacDonald gave him some unofficial duties in solving the unemployment problem, but Mosley was generally impeded in his efforts by more senior Labour Party stalwarts who had been involved in the party's economic policy formation for decades. As this occurred, his frustrations with his position in the Labour administration grew. The events of the late 1920s and early 1930s were to determine the course of the rest of Mosley's life. In the autumn of 1929, after a half-decade of intense economic growth, as Europe was rebuilt following the First World War and the civil wars that had followed through 1923, the economy in Europe and the Americas became so overheated that it resulted in the Wall Street crash, one of the largest financial meltdowns in history. As is well known, the Great Depression followed, a period of economic decline and stagnation that saw tens of millions of people lose their jobs and a level of deprivation amongst the poor of countries like Britain, Germany, and the United States that is without equal in modern times. The Great Depression also led to massive political fluctuations in Europe and the Western Hemisphere that led to the collapse of centrist governments. From 1930 onwards, political extremes on the left and right were once again in vogue. For Mosley, the crisis of the Great Depression led to him once again reconsidering his political stances as he came to conclude that the Labour Party did not have the ability or the ideas to meet the economic crisis head-on. Having flirted with the Conservatives in years gone by, and now the Labour movement, he would, from 1930 onwards, hew his own political path. The first major sign of Mosley's increasingly independent streak was seen in 1930 when he drew up and released what is now known as the Mosley Memorandum. The memorandum was Mosley's blueprint for how Britain could pull itself out of the Great Depression. In it, he called for the implementation of high tariffs on imports of goods from other European countries in order to protect British industry and commerce in the midst of the crisis, a measure which he believed would increase employment at home. Where goods had to come into Britain from abroad, he proposed that they should be sourced from parts of the British Empire, rather than obtained from the United States, Germany, France, or other competitors. He also called for the nationalization of certain British industries, a radical overhaul of the educational system to ensure British men and women stayed in education for longer and more people went on to higher education, while other features of the memorandum aimed towards reducing the highly class-based nature of British society. Effectively, what Mosley was aiming towards was a state-led version of a knowledge economy where the aim was to create a broad and dynamic middle class. While Mosley is a very controversial figure today, there is no denying the fact that there were attractive elements to the memorandum, and it was widely praised at the time by economists, including John Maynard Keynes, the most important economist of the first half of the 20th century. Over half a century later, policy analysts in the British Conservative Party reconsidered it as a means of responding to the economic downturn of the early 1990s. As much as the memorandum was praised by figures like Keynes at the time, it was clear to Mosley that it would not be accepted as the basis of the Labour Party's economic policy. He quickly decided to split with the party. However, unlike Winston Churchill, whose family was somewhat close to the Mosleys and who had once crossed the floor from the Conservatives to the Liberals, only to come back again to the Conservatives in the 1920s, Mosley would not return to the Tories, nor would he join the Liberals, which were a rapidly declining force in British politics once support for the Labour Party expanded in the 1920s. Instead, Mosley formed his own party, calling it the New Party. Formally established in the spring of 1931, it immediately emerged as a minor parliamentary group as Mosley convinced half a dozen fellow Labour MPs to join him. Its main policy platform was the Mosley Memorandum. Ultimately, the New Party lasted for only a year, for in 1932, Mosley formed a new organization and amalgamated the New Party into it. He called it the British Union of Fascists. Meanwhile, the New Party lost its parliamentary representation quickly as its main figures, including Mosley, lost their seats in the 1931 general election. It is worth pausing in our story to consider the politics of Europe in the 1930s. The economic and social crisis wrought by the Great Depression, combined with the fears of a communist takeover of much of Europe following the establishment of the Soviet Union and near the end of the First World War, had created a general desire for a new form of politics in Europe, one which combined elements of radical nationalism and also elements of socialism. This curious mix of left and right-wing politics is typically identified as fascism today and is associated with extreme racial views, but contemporaries would have understood it more as a form of corporatism. The idea that the citizens of a country would be unified in a corporate manner in furthering and advancing their nation's cause in a way which was both nationalistic but also socialistic in the sense that the well-being of the middle and lower classes was to be favored as much as the upper classes. While it has enormously sinister overtones today as a result of the barbaric racial elements which were incorporated into this fascist politics when Mosley established the British Union of Fascists in 1932, those same negative overtones did not yet exist. Moreover, what he was doing was entirely in keeping with the general drift of politics in the Western world at that time. Nearly every country in Central Europe adopted some form of fascism or corporatism in the mid-1930s. So did Portugal and Spain, and even in countries where corporatist parties did not rise to power, such as in Ireland, there were still quasi-fascist movements during the 1930s that had major links to the political establishment. As such, What Mosley was doing in the early to mid-1930s needs to be viewed in context. The period when Mosley was establishing the new party and then the British Union of Fascists in 1931 and 1932 were also years of continuing infidelity in his marriage. The new object of his affections in the early 1930s was Diana Guinness, a scion of the Mitford family, a British aristocratic family that could trace their lineage all the way back to the Norman conquest in the 11th century. Diana was married to Brian Guinness, a member of the wealthy Anglo-Irish brewing dynasty, and, as with Oswald, she had children from her first marriage. Nevertheless, she divorced her husband in 1932, and her affair with Oswald became more and more serious over time. For his part, he had repeatedly asserted his intention to leave Cynthia, though one suspects he might never have done so had fate not intervened in 1933, as Cynthia died at just 34 years of age from complications of peritonitis, which, in turn, had emerged following an operation for appendicitis. With this, Oswald and Diana were able to pursue their relationship more openly, and they soon emerged as the most prominent couple in the world of British fascism, with Diana espousing the political movement faithfully, having come from a family which was keenly divided between adherents of fascism and socialism. It was not until 1936 that Oswald and Diana eventually married. They would have 2 sons, Alexander and Max. The British Union of Fascists had mixed success in the 1930s. Its membership grew to over 50,000 people, and it began to acquire support from elements of the established British media, such as the Daily Mail newspaper, which once ran a headline proclaiming, quote, "Hooray for the black shirts," in reference to the black shirt uniform which Mosley had the members of the BUF adopt. It found particular success in certain parts of London and other urban centres where unemployment was high as a result of the Great Depression, and there was a growing anti-migration sentiment. However, it met with very little electoral success, not contesting the 1935 general election and holding no more than a few seats on local councils at various points in the 1930s. This is how things stood for the most part throughout the decade. But while the BUF did not have any real parliamentary presence, they were still a factor in British political life that could not be avoided, with their distinctive uniforms, their rallies, and Mosley's oratory. Even those who reviled the BUF politically had to admit that Oswald was perhaps the most effective political speaker in the country during the 1930s. If the BUF met with little electoral success in the 1930s, this was perhaps largely owing to concerns about the party's connections to European fascism and, in particular, with Nazi Germany. The Nazis under Adolf Hitler had come to power there in 1933. Much of their rhetoric centered on reviving Germany after the humiliation of the First World War and the Treaty of Versailles that had been imposed on Germany in 1919. With their talk of Germany's re-emergence as the greatest power on the continent, many in Britain were uneasy about this new political experiment being orchestrated from Berlin and what implications it might have for Britain and for peace in Europe. Despite the general unease with Hitler, Mosley positively cozied up to the Nazis. When he and Diana were married in 1936, the ceremony was carried out in Germany at the home of the Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels. Mosley was also a great admirer of the Italian fascist leader Benito Mussolini. In 1937, he began an initiative to establish a pro-German radio station broadcasting from the Channel Islands. It was all enough to give many in Britain pause as to where Mosley's political loyalties lay and what his motives were with the BUF. Hand in hand with his growing ties to the fascist movements on the continent was an adoption of an increasingly xenophobic and anti-Semitic stance by Mosley and the BUF, particularly towards the Jewish community in Britain. There was also a more virulent form of anti-migration rhetoric in Mosley's political statements towards groups such as the Irish and the peoples of the British Empire in regions like India and South Africa, a development which points towards a fundamental shift in his own political views from the more tolerant figure of the 1920s. All of this came to a head on the 4th of October 1936 in the Battle of Cable Street in the East End of London. That day, a march was held by Mosley and the BUF, one which would involve separate divisions of the Black Shirts and their supporters, proceeding from the Tower of London to Bethnal Green and Shoreditch, where speeches would be made by Mosley and others. In response, a separate countermarch was organized by a coalition of anti-fascists, including the British Communists, trade unionists, and groups representing both the Jewish and Irish communities in London. Barricades were also erected by those opposed to Mosley's event, primarily on Cable Street, to impede their march, thus the name the Battle of Cable Street. The Metropolitan Police managed to prevent the event from boiling over into major violence, with well over 100 people arrested. Overall, it demonstrated the growing racism of the BUF movement, but also the determination of many different groups in London to unite to oppose them. A petition to try to prevent the march garnered over 100,000 signatures, and the government moved afterwards to pass the Public Order Act of 1936, which prohibited large gatherings in which paramilitary uniforms, like those of the Black Shirts, would be worn. The late 1930s were an increasingly fractious period in the history of the BUF. On the continent, Germany was rapidly rearming in a breach of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, while in the spring of 1938 it violated another major tenet of the peace treaty of 1919 by entering a political union with Austria to create a Greater Germany. No sooner was this undertaken than Hitler began pressing Britain, France, and Italy to be allowed to annex the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia where a majority of people spoke German and identified as being ethnically German. Eventually, the British and French caved to pressure from Hitler at the Munich Conference of September 1938, but warned that any further acts of aggressive expansion would lead to war. As these events played out, Mosley and the BUF became ever more controversial in England. At a rally in Liverpool late in 1937, members of the public pelted Mosley with rocks after he gave a fascist salute to the crowd. Yet, he continued to have a loyal following. At the Britain First rally held at Earl's Court Exhibition Hall on the 16th of July 1939, 30,000 people attended the largest indoor political rally in British history. There, Mosley inflamed the crowd with talk of how a Jewish conspiracy was leading Britain to war with countries that should be its natural allies, and that the coming general election, which was due to be held in 1940, would be bought and sold by Jewish financiers and those who controlled the media. It was a clear manifestation of the degree to which Mosley had adopted the ideological beliefs of German Nazism. Even as Mosley was presenting his conspiracy-laden and anti-Semitic speech to his loyal base of followers at Earl's Court, Europe was plunging into war. In March 1939, Hitler and the Nazis abandoned the promises made at Munich the previous autumn and annexed the rest of Czechoslovakia, with the city of Memel stripped from Lithuania at the same time. Their attention then turned to Poland. The Nazis began an aggressive campaign to convince Europe of Germany's rights to Polish territory. In August 1939, just weeks after Mosley's Britain First rally, a non-aggression pact was signed between Germany and its ideological enemy, the Soviet Union, paving the way for the Nazis to invade Poland on the 1st of September after a false flag operation. As German tanks rolled over the eastern border, London and Paris declared war on Berlin. The Second World War remained a largely European affair for months thereafter, with little major action. The Germans and Russians quickly overran Poland and carved it up between them, but little occurred in the winter of 1939 and the spring of 1940, so much so that some began to call the war a phony war. It wasn't until the late spring that the next steps were taken when Denmark and Norway were quickly occupied by the Germans, and then the German Wehrmacht began massing on the western border for the long-awaited invasion of France. In Britain, Mosley's position was utterly compromised by these events. As the leader of the British fascist movement and as someone who had made no secret of his ties to the regime in Berlin, he was now viewed as the leader of a potential fifth column, a British equivalent of Vidkun Quisling, the former Norwegian Minister of Defense who had formed a fascist party there in 1933, the National Samling, or National Gathering. Quisling had facilitated the Nazi occupation of Norway in April 1940 and later became the head of Nazi Norway. Mosley was perceived as a potential British version of Quisling. Yet there was also the possibility that he might be useful for the British government. There was no shortage of individuals in late 1939 and into 1940 in Britain, many within government circles, that believed Britain would be better off reaching an arrangement with Hitler and the Nazis and combining against the Soviet Union and other radical movements on the far left of the political spectrum. In calling throughout the first months of the war for a negotiated peace, Mosley was positioning himself as someone who could negotiate with Berlin on Britain's behalf, if the tide swung in favor of peace. Whatever ambitions Mosley might have held to become the architect of peace was scuttled in just a few weeks in May 1940. Early that month, in response to a growing crisis over the wartime leadership of Mosley's old rival from the 1924 general election, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain was forced to step down as Prime Minister. He was succeeded by Winston Churchill, a figure who had consistently warned about the threat posed by the Nazis during the 1930s and who was committed to war with Germany. With this, Mosley's hopes of negotiating peace terms ended. Moreover, the same day that Churchill took office, the 10th of May 1940, German army divisions invaded neutral Belgium and then headed into northeastern France. The campaign which followed was a disaster for the French and the British Expeditionary Force, the latter of which only narrowly avoided complete destruction at Dunkirk. With the fall of France and a potential German invasion of Britain on the horizon, the British government moved to secure its position domestically. In late May, Mosley was arrested and interned under Defense Regulation 18B. This emergency legislation had been passed in September 1939 at the beginning of the war to allow for the arrest and detention of suspected enemies of the state during wartime without charge or trial. It was primarily utilized in the years that followed against the British Union of Fascists and members of the Irish nationalist movement in Northern Ireland who were opposed to the partition of the island back in 1921. Mosley would be held for 3 years under Regulation 18B. The terms of Mosley's internment during the Second World War were not as onerous as they might have been, in considerable part owing to the intervention of the Prime Minister. Although their political views had diverged enormously during the 1930s to occupy the polar opposites of the political spectrum in Britain, Churchill had admired Mosley back in the 1920s and viewed him as a figure of great potential. In 1940, he arranged for Mosley to be held under favorable conditions at Royal Holloway Prison. His wife Diana was detained as well in the summer of 1940 after giving birth to their son, Max. She was allowed to join Oswald, apparently due to the direct intervention of Churchill. The reasons for this lay with the tangled paternity of Churchill's wife Clementine. Clementine's mother, Blanche, had been known for her infidelity during her lifetime, and it was widely suspected that Clementine's father was actually Algernon Bertram Freeman Mitford, Diana Mosley's grandfather. Diana's family apparently appealed to Clementine and Churchill in 1940 to ensure that Diana and Oswald were interned together. Meanwhile, their children from their first marriages and their marriage to one another were looked after by several different family members during their period of detention. Oswald spent 3 years in prison. He and Diana were not charged, for though they had come under very reasonable suspicion as the leading figures of British fascism, they were not technically guilty of having committed any crime. By 1943, their detention had become something of a cause célèbre in British politics. This was related to the changing circumstances of the war. While Mosley had been arrested in the direst days in 1940 as France was about to fall and the Battle of Britain lay ahead, the nature of the conflict had altered dramatically from late 1941 onwards as the German assault on the Soviet Union failed to strike the killer blow before the Russian winter set in, and the United States joined the war following the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese. 1942 saw the Western Allies turn the tide in the North Africa campaign against the Italians and Germans, and in the summer of 1943 they opened a southern front in Italy. Meanwhile, the Battle of Stalingrad was won by the Russians in the autumn and winter of 1942. With this, the course of the war had changed enormously in favor of the Allies, and any danger that Mosley and other British fascist leaders had posed was effectively nullified. Consequently, after a major debate in the House of Commons in the early winter of 1943, the Mosleys were released. They would still spend the remainder of the war under house arrest. Oswald and Diana spent the last year and a half of the war living with Mitford relatives and at the Shaven Crown Hotel in Oxfordshire. Their movements were restricted and they were kept under police supervision, but they were reunited with their children and were given a large degree of liberty. The press covered their movements extensively. This was also a period when news of the Holocaust of 6 million of Europe's Jews and the mass murder of other groups, such as the Romani and Sinti people by the Nazis, began arriving to Britain in the final months of the war as camps were liberated across Europe. In these months and the years that followed the war, Mosley never expressed any regret for his involvement with the Nazis in the 1930s or the anti-Semitism of the British Union of Fascists. Moreover, in years to come, he would become one of the leading voices in Britain in efforts to argue that the Holocaust had been exaggerated or that it had been orchestrated by rogue elements within the SS rather than having been directly ordered by Hitler and the other senior members of the Nazi regime. As such, while Mosley's politics moved on to other concerns in the post-war period, he never expressed any contrition for his role in the fascist politics of the 1930s and the genocidal programs which had resulted from it on the continent. With the end of the war in Europe in the early summer of 1945, Mosley was now free to return to his life without any further punishment. One might have expected him to be happy enough to live a private life, enjoying his family's extensive wealth and staying out of politics after spending half a decade in prison and under house arrest. Furthermore, he was not in good social standing after the war in a way which might merit a political comeback. This did not deter Mosley in the slightest. After reconnecting with many of those who had been involved in the BUF prior to its prohibition on the 23rd of May 1940, the very same day that Mosley was arrested, he began plotting his political comeback. To this end, in 1946 and 1947, he published 2 political memoirs and defenses of his conduct in the 1930s, respectively entitled My Answer and The Alternative. My Answer, in particular, set out to portray Mosley as a British patriot who had been unjustly maligned during the war years. His argument was that he could not have known what would transpire from 1939 onwards, and though it would have fallen on deaf ears at the mid-1940s, there had been many prominent political figures who had not exactly been virulently opposed to the Nazis back in the 1930s, notably Britain's wartime leader during the First World War, David Lloyd George, and the former British monarch, Edward VIII. Having presented these arguments in his books, Mosley returned to politics in 1948 when he formed the Union Movement. In many ways, the Union Movement was a return to his old politics. The party certainly fell far on the right of the political spectrum. Its economic views were corporatist, and it continued the anti-Semitism of the interwar fascist movements, with Mosley trying to make political capital out of developments in the Levant, where the Zionist movement had become violently opposed to the British Mandate administration in the 2 years following the end of the Second World War. But where the Union movement differed from Mosley's pre-war political ideology was in its promotion of pan-Europeanism. In his 1947 book, The Answer, Mosley laid out a theory that Europe had been moving inexorably towards a greater union for several centuries, beginning with the formation of large nation-states such as the United Kingdom, Spain, Germany and Italy out of much smaller polities during the late medieval and early modern periods. Mosley's conclusion was that the formation of a European supranational state, one which would unite countries like Britain, France and Germany after centuries of conflict, was inevitable. Such a state would operate on the basis of a centralized European authority, with individual countries retaining large degrees of autonomy, but acting in union with one another on a wide array of issues, particularly economic policy. In this way, Mosley argued, the new movement, which he called Europe, a Nation, would be able to walk its own relatively independent line without being dominated by either the United States or the Soviet Union in the emerging post-war Cold War order. Thus, very quickly after the end of the Second World War, Mosley sought to rehabilitate himself as a major advocate of pan-Europeanism, or a form of European nationalism, as a replacement to the National Socialism and corporatism of the 1930s. There is no disguising the fact that what Mosley was arguing for in the post-war years was very much a political movement that mirrored how the European coal and steel community, then the European Economic Community, and finally the European Union would develop, though Britain was slow to embrace involvement in the European project and was a hesitant member for 4 decades before pulling out in the late 2010s. Perhaps it was this British ambivalence to the growing pan-European movement which led to the Union movement meeting with little success, though it was much more likely that the very support of Mosley would have made the British public even less supportive of involvement with the inaugural ECSC in the 1950s. The British press had not forgotten the Mosleys' wartime betrayal, and at the start of the 1950s, Oswald and Diana, with their younger children, moved to Ireland, a country where anyone ostracized from the British political system was welcome, no matter how dubious the road which had led to their disgrace. The Mosleys lived there for several years, an exile which was made more favorable by the fact that several of Diana Mitford's siblings also had ties to Ireland. Deborah Mitford, for instance, having married into the Cavendish family, which had extensive estates in the south of the country. As much as Mosley might have tried to embrace a less controversial form of politics in the post-war years and attempted a political comeback, his politics retained their racist edge. 2 developments in the 1950s emphasize this. First of these related to Africa. In the aftermath of the war, Britain was unable to ignore calls for independence from many of its colonies. After India and Pakistan acquired their independence in 1947, calls escalated for the same in Africa, where the British held lands covering much of southern Africa, around modern-day Zimbabwe, Botswana and Zambia, extensive territories further north around Uganda, Kenya and Sudan, and other lands to the west in Nigeria and Ghana. Mosley's solution to calls for independence was a form of continent-wide apartheid, whereby the European powers, Britain and France being the 2 nations who controlled huge swathes of the continent, would divide their colonies into white and black-controlled areas, mirroring in many ways the system which had been created in South Africa in the late 1940s to preserve the position of the white minority Afrikaner community there. Mosley's proposals were soon abandoned, especially in the aftermath of the disastrous Suez Crisis of 1956, and the British and French began granting independence to nations all across the continent. Mosley would remain an ardent supporter of the apartheid regime in South Africa for the remainder of his life, visiting there in the 1960s, long after the apartheid movement had started to become controversial internationally. Furthermore, he continued holding business interests in South Africa throughout the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. The second episode, which was revelatory of Mosley's racial views in the post-war period, occurred in Britain itself in the late 1950s. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Britain, like many other European countries, had been left with a large labor shortage owing to the death of hundreds of thousands of young men during the war. Where Germany, for instance, had turned to countries like Turkey for foreign workers, Britain reached out to its empire. In the course of the late 1940s, tens of thousands of people began arriving from the Caribbean and other regions, the so-called Windrush generation, named after the HMS Empire Windrush, a ship that had arrived with one of the first large numbers of Caribbean migrants in 1948. By the mid-1950s, the growing influx of people from overseas into London and England more broadly was creating increasing inter-community hostility in some parts of England's major cities, especially during periods of low employment, when people born in England perceived the newcomers as taking jobs they might otherwise have acquired. This led, in the autumn of 1958, to the Notting Hill race riots in the Notting Hill area of London. A week of violence saw attacks on people of West Indian descent and scores of arrests. Mosley's reaction was to return to England and run for election in the Kensington district of London in 1959, fashioning his campaign around exploiting racial tensions in the capital. Some of the proposals he mooted during the campaign were aggressive in the extreme, not just favoring a ban on further migration from the empire or what remained of it, but also proposing forced deportations of those who had arrived in the decade or so after the war, and a ban on intermarriage. It was as close to a major political breakthrough that he would ever have in the post-war years, capturing nearly 10% of the vote, though ultimately failing to win a seat. In the aftermath of his failed election bid in 1959, Mosley relocated with Diana to Paris. They spent the remainder of their lives for the most part in Orsay, a wealthy suburb on the outskirts of the city. From here, he began efforts to try to coordinate with other pan-European far-right political movements in other countries. This led, in the 1960s, to the formation of the National Party of Europe, an umbrella organization which included Mosley's union movement in Britain, the Deutsche Reichspartei in West Germany, the Italian Social Movement, and Jeune Europe in Belgium, all far-right parties with elements of neo-fascism in their workings. A manifesto released in 1962 foreshadowed many elements of what would become the European Union, calling for a European Parliament and other federal measures of that kind. That others harked back to the corporatist politics of the right in the 1930s in declaring the movement's antipathy to both communism and capitalism. Effectively, it called for a third way, whereby Europe would separate itself off from both the US and the USSR, while another proposal was for the dismantling of the United Nations and its replacement with a tripartite body which would be formed of the US, the USSR, and the new European supranational state. A final novel element to it was the description of parts of Africa as constituting part of Europe. Clearly, a provision that was designed to keep the Maghreb under European control in order to generate support for the movement in France, as that country was still at war to try to retain control over Algeria. The National Party of Europe met with very little success in the 1960s or 1970s, though its policy platform is curious in retrospect, as offering an alternative view of pan-Europeanism at a time when the founder members of the European steel and coal community were only beginning to consider the idea of a more formal union between their countries. Interestingly, while the far right has generally become opposed to European federalism in the intervening decades, in the 1960s, far-right parties were in favor of federalism, though of a kind which sought to curb migration from overseas and implied a land grab of North Africa. Meeting with little success in the initiative, Mosley began writing an autobiography in the second half of the 1960s, one which would build on the political defense he had first provided in My Answer back in 1946. My Life was published in 1968. It was hardly an attempt to seek redemption for his past political life, but rather sought to explain away certain criticisms of him which had been made over the years, with Mosley being unrepentant in his views that Europe should be a continent for Europeans, and claiming that his politics in the 1930s was a response to the ineffectiveness of both Labour and the Conservatives. By the time My Life was published in 1968, Mosley had entered his 70s. His health was gradually declining. He had made one last effort to gain election in Britain in 1966, and after a fresh humiliation in which he acquired less than 5% of the vote, he effectively resigned himself to the end of his political career. The Union movement was wound up in the early 1970s and was replaced by the National Front as the main far-right party in Britain. By the time it began in the mid-1970s to gain some popularity in Britain, as the UK entered the worst economic crisis it had seen since the Great Depression, Mosley was suffering from Parkinson's in France. His last years were spent largely uninvolved in active politics owing to poor health and old age. He died in Orsay on the 3rd of December 1980 at 84 years of age. A small funeral was held in Paris, after which Oswald was cremated and his remains were scattered around the famous Père Lachaise cemetery. Just over 2 years later, his eldest son, Nicholas, born in 1923 of his first marriage to Cynthia, published a 2-volume biography of his father and the Mosleys' family life. Oswald had requested Nicholas, who he had a difficult relationship with, to write it, making his private papers fully available to allow him to do so. The work was generally critical of Oswald and his political career, while humanizing him as a father. Oswald Mosley was a complex figure. It would be easy today to dismiss him as simply a would-be fascist dictator of Britain, and admittedly, there were many elements of that kind to his politics. Yet his political views in the 1930s should not be read entirely in light of what the Nazis did across Europe in the late 1930s and first half of the 1940s. There were different types of corporatism and fascism, such as Franco's regime in Spain. Similarly, Mosley's form of corporatism was different to what was being espoused in Germany. Moreover, his economic policies were endorsed by a large cross-section of leading British economists during the Great Depression, while his pan-Europeanism after the Second World War foreshadowed the general drift of politics within what has become the European Union. However, these complicating factors aside, there is absolutely no doubt that Mosley also advocated for a form of racial hierarchy, one which displayed acute anti-Semitism, and also called for racial segregation across Africa, where much of the continent would have been transformed into an expanded version of apartheid South Africa. As such, while his political views were complicated, they were also not entirely estranged from the racial fascism of Nazism. What do you think of Oswald Mosley? Should he be perceived as a straightforward fifth column of the Nazi movement within Britain? Or was he a more complex figure? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. The man known to history as General Franco was born on the 4th of December 1892 as Francisco Franco Bahamonde in the coastal city of El Ferrol in the province of Galicia in the northwest of Spain. His father was Nicolás Franco, a descendant of an Andalusian family which had served in the Spanish Navy for 6 generations back into the early 18th century, and Nicolás himself would continue this tradition, working as an officer in the Spanish Naval Administrators Corps in the late 19th century. However, the relationship between Nicolás and his son Francisco would prove to be fraught, Nicolás being eccentric and a somewhat decadent character, traits which his son grew to dislike in his father. Francisco's mother was Maria del Pilar Bahamonde de Andrade, a native Galician from a well-to-do upper-middle-class family. Francisco would grow to become close to his mother, admiring her Roman Catholic piety and the serious demeanor she displayed, in contrast to his father. As Francisco grew up, he developed a disciplined and serious character himself from a young age. He was originally destined for a career in the Spanish Navy, like multiple generations of the Francos before him. However, his family life was thrown into turmoil in 1907, when Francisco was just 14 years old. At this time, his father Nicholas abandoned his family and would soon marry another woman in Madrid. Francisco never forgave him and only maintained a limited relationship with his father for the remainder of his life. It is hardly a coincidence that just around the time that Nicolas Franco abandoned his family in Galicia, Francisco discarded any plans to join the Spanish Navy and instead entered the Spanish Infantry Academy in Toledo at just 14 years of age, though the decision was also partly attributable to the massive decline in the Spanish Navy in the aftermath of the Spanish-American War of 1898. Francisco eventually graduated in 1910 as a second lieutenant. His performance at the academy had been relatively modest, graduating towards the lower end of his class, but this can be partially explained by his age, many of the cadets at Toledo being 2 or 3 years older than Franco. The Spain that Franco now entered military service for was on the cusp of a protracted political emergency. Indeed, it had been enduring a very prolonged crisis in one shape or another for 2 centuries. In the 16th century, Spain had been the foremost European power, the superpower of its day, fueled by an enormous empire in the New World and huge gold and silver bullion flows from Mexico and Peru. However, in the 17th century, the Spanish Empire had entered into a period of rapid decline as those same bullion inflows from the Americas dried up, such that by the 18th century, Spain was a second-rate power with a backward, underdeveloped economy. Moreover, the country's politics were crippled by the excessive power of the Roman Catholic Church and an ineffective monarchy. Then, in the early 19th century, independence movements in South America and Central America robbed the country of most of its overseas empire. However, a reform movement was underway. During the first years of the 19th century, the country fell into the orbit of Napoleonic France, and a new generation of Spanish politicians was calling for a complete overhaul of the country's politics, economy, and society. A new liberal constitution was adopted in 1812, but tensions remained. As a result, the civil war, known as the First Carlist War, occurred between 1833 and 1840 over the succession to the monarchy and disputes between liberals and conservatives within the country. 2 further Carlist wars would follow in the late 1840s and the mid-1870s, the Third Carlist War having briefly seen the monarchy suspended, and the First Spanish Republic created between 1873 and 1874. Thus, when Franco was born in 1892, the country had been subjected to nearly a century of conflict between left-leaning liberal reformers who wished to reduce the power of the monarchy, aristocracy, and Roman Catholic Church, and right-leaning conservatives determined to keep the traditional structures of Spanish society and politics in place. These twin forces would continue to dominate Spanish politics into the early 20th century and shape the course of Franco's life. At the time that he left the Infantry Academy in Toledo in 1910, though, the more calamitous political confrontations which Spain was to endure in the 1930s were still some way off. In the early 1910s, the Iberian state's main concerns lay in North Africa, where the country held some of the last vestiges of its once great colonial empire, having lost the bulk of its other possessions in the Caribbean and the Philippines in the late 1890s. In particular, Morocco had become a major focus of Spanish imperial activity. The country had held territories here for several centuries, notably the city of Ceuta across the Straits of Gibraltar. Spanish interest in the region had been further expanded in the First Hispano-Moroccan War between 1859 and 1860, and brief conflicts with some of the Rif tribes of northern Morocco in 1893 and again in 1909. a more substantial land grab was effected in November 1912 when a treaty was agreed between France and Spain, whereby Morocco was divided between them, Spain acquiring the entire north coast of the country at a strip of land in the south, while France took the more expansive central parts of Morocco. Yet while the agreement between the two European powers had established their respective spheres of influence, making a reality of Spanish rule in the newly acquired territory was a more protracted affair. Efforts to pacify the various tribes and political groupings in Morocco would occupy the attentions of the Spanish military for the remainder of the 1910s. Thus it was that Franco, fresh from the academy in Toledo, volunteered to take up a position in North Africa in 1912 at the age of 19. Franco's service in Morocco began his swift ascent within the Spanish military. In 1913, he was promoted to first lieutenant in an elite regiment of Moroccan cavalry. He became well known for his professionalism and command abilities, and also for the concern he showed for the well-being of the troops under his command. In 1915, he was appointed as a captain, the youngest individual in the entire Spanish army to hold that post. But the following year, in 1916, he suffered a serious gunshot wound in the abdomen. As a result, the young Franco, now just 24 years of age, was sent back to Spain and would spend the next few years back in southwestern Europe. The establishment of the Spanish Foreign Legion in 1920 and Franco's appointment as second-in-command of the newly established brigade was the direct cause of his return to North Africa in the early 1920s, as yet another war erupted between the Spanish and the Berber tribes of the Rif Mountains, one which would last on this occasion for half a decade between 1921 and 1926. In 1923, he was further promoted to the top command of the Spanish Foreign Legion, the same year that he married Maria del Carmen Polo, with whom he would have a daughter in 1926. Like her mother, she was named Maria del Carmen, and she would be Franco's only child. Shortly after their marriage in 1923, he was called to visit Madrid for an audience with the Spanish king, Alfonso XIII. This meeting was indicative of the growing fame which Franco was earning within Spain for his military service in Morocco. Moreover, this occurred at a time when the power of the military was growing. In September 1923, the king endorsed what was effectively a seizure of power by General Miguel Primo de Rivera, who would head the Spanish government for the next 7 years with the slogan, "Country, Religion, Monarchy," a clear indication of his desire to rule Spain along traditional conservative lines. Back in North Africa, Franco was instrumental in bringing the Rif War to a successful conclusion. In the course of 1925 and 1926, his reputation now soared throughout Spain to that of a national hero, and on the 3rd of February 1926, he was rewarded with a promotion to the rank of Brigadier General. Franco was just 33 years of age at the time, and the elevation to the rank of general made him one of the youngest generals in any European army. 2 years later, he was appointed as the director of the newly established General Military Academy in the city of Zaragoza. These actions of the 1920s were crucial for later events, as Franco's subsequent rise to power in the 1930s was predicated, to a large extent, on the reputation he had gained for his command in North Africa, and also the loyal following he engendered amongst graduates from the academy in Zaragoza between 1928 and the early 1930s. The events which would eventually culminate in the Spanish Civil War and Franco's ascent to power have their origins in 1930. In late January that year, the effective head of the Spanish government since 1923, General Miguel Primo de Rivera, was forced to resign owing to a deepening economic crisis in Spain and public discontent with the direction of the country's politics. There now followed 15 months of political instability in the country, culminating in municipal elections in April 1931, in which the Republicans won over 40% of the vote, as opposed to just 25% for the monarchists. This was perceived as a referendum on the monarchy of King Alfonso XIII. one which he listened to the result of. On the night of the 14th of April 1931, just 2 days after the elections, he left Spain without abdicating. Earlier that same day, the Second Spanish Republic had been formally declared, ending the Spanish monarchy and ushering in a new period of Spanish politics. The leaders of the newly proclaimed republic now undertook wide-ranging reforms of the country, its economy, the role of the church, and the military. As someone who was closely associated with Alfonso's rule and de Rivera's government, Franco's career now stalled. He was removed from his position at the academy in Zaragoza, and the school itself was dissolved. Franco was a monarchist and was ideologically opposed to the Second Spanish Republic, but he nevertheless indicated his willingness to accept the new dispensation and work with the government in the early 1930s. This, however, was not enough to prevent the new government from effectively demoting him to a number of minor commands during the first years of the Second Spanish Republic. The new republic was bedeviled by instability during its brief life, including attempted coups and regional instability, all of which would eventually culminate in the Spanish Civil War. Before that calamitous conflict erupted, however, the country lurched from liberal to conservative regimes and back again. In 1933, the Spanish Confederation of the Autonomous Rights were the victors in elections to the Spanish legislature, prizing power from the liberal parties, which had seized power in 1931. The 1933 elections were a boon for Franco's flagging career. He was restored to a more active command, and in 1934, he was promoted to Major General. That October, he was placed in charge of suppressing a violent revolt amongst miners in the province of Asturias, who were unhappy with the growing influence of the conservatives within the Spanish government cabinet. His successful prosecution of the Asturias insurrection would see him appointed as chief of the Spanish Army's General Staff. On the 19th of May 1935, the insurgency in Asturias and Franco's stated views on it also points to where his ideological views and personal politics lay by this time. Franco described the insurgency as a frontier war, one being perpetrated by socialists and communists with the goal of overthrowing civilization itself in Spain. Franco's anti-leftist credentials were being established in this manner, just as the Spanish political landscape was lurching into its ultimate crisis. A series of scandals in the mid-1930s led to the dissolution of Parliament and the calling of new elections for February 1936. This occurred at a time when the country's politics had polarized to an unprecedented extent between a left bloc of communists, socialists, and radical Republicans united into a coalition termed the Popular Front, and a right bloc of monarchists, conservatives, Spanish traditionalists, and ultra-Catholics, with the latter having a large amount of support from elements within the military hierarchy and the colonial administration in North Africa. Despite this coalition on the right, the left were victorious in the elections of 1936, and Manuel Aznar, the leader of the Republican Left Party, was quickly made president in a new government of the left. Azar's appointment as president in 1936 was the catalyst for elements on the right, and in particular within the military, to now begin plotting a coup d'etat. As this was occurring, Franco was effectively in exile. In February 1936, he had been sent to the Canary Islands as a military commander there, a position which was effectively a form of banishment from Spain itself. Up to this point, General Franco had largely remained aloof from any of the political parties in Spain, but he was now contacted by those elements within the military who wished to overthrow the government of the Second Spanish Republic in order to end the anarchy which had characterized Spain's politics throughout the 1930s. In June 1936, he met with the officers in question in a forest on the island of Tenerife to discuss the coup. At this point, Franco refused to commit to the insurrection, but in the weeks ahead, he did so. The revolt will be led by three individuals: General José Sanjurjo, a monarchist opponent of the Second Republic who was living in exile in Portugal, would be its symbolic head, while Emilio Mola y Udal, first Duke of Mola, would lead the revolt on the Spanish mainland. Franco took command of the Spanish colonial armies in North Africa. The Spanish Civil War began on the 17th of July, 1936, a day earlier than planned, when the Army of Africa rebelled in Morocco. The following day, Franco flew from the Canary Islands to North Africa, as the rebel forces were seizing control of large parts of Spain. By the end of July, the insurrectionists, who were now referring to their broad coalition of political groupings as the Nationalists, had gained the support of elements throughout North Africa, and in the towns and hinterlands of Zaragoza, Sevilla, Córdoba, Valladolid, Burgos, and Pamplona in Spain itself. However, the government, broadly identified as the Republicans, managed to maintain control over the largest cities, including Madrid, Barcelona, Bilbao, Malaga, and Valencia. With the two sides both holding or seizing substantial parts of the country, the stage was set for a prolonged and bitter conflict. This was exacerbated by the political, economic, and military aid which both sides were receiving. The Republicans would quickly be supported by Soviet Russia, while aid and direct military support was channeled to the Nationalists by the Nazi regime, led by Adolf Hitler in Germany, and the fascist government of Benito Mussolini in Italy. Other nations, such as the United States, France, and Britain, declared their neutrality, but could not stop independent brigades forming and traveling to Spain to fight on behalf of one side or the other. As a result of all this, the Spanish Civil War became a proxy war in the wider showdown between the political right and left in Europe in the years prior to the outbreak of the Second World War. It also acted as a means of trialing the new developments in military hardware, which had been made since the First World War. Notably, the rapid advances in airplanes, which had occurred since the 1910s. The Civil War itself became a long war of attrition, having quickly seized the Spanish protectorate in North Africa in late July 1936. Franco was able to convey a large proportion of the North African army, which consisted of approximately 30,000 men, to Andalusia, in southwestern Spain, in early August. He then began a march on Madrid, with the goal of seizing the Spanish capital from the Republicans and bringing the war to a swift conclusion. However, by the time he advanced on the city in October 1936, significant enough aid had been channeled to the Republicans by the Soviets and other communist powers that Franco failed to secure the Spanish capital. With this, the possibility of a short, swift victory for the Nationalists had passed. As the war settled down into a protracted struggle in late 1936 and into 1937, the Nationalists organized themselves into a provisional government at Burgos, a town to the north of Madrid, which had been a capital of the Kingdom of Castile and was a symbolic site for the nationalist government during the Civil War. On the 1st of October 1936, Franco was proclaimed Generalissimo of the Nationalist Army. He would soon become the supreme leader of the Nationalists in the Civil War, as on just the third day of the rebellion, the 20th of July 1936, General José Sanjurjo had been killed when flying back to Spain from Portugal. Then on the 3rd of June 1937, Emilio Mola was also killed in an air accident when his plane flew into the side of a mountain as a result of bad weather when flying to Vitoria in the Basque country. This left Franco as the undisputed leader of the Nationalists in the Civil War and paved the way for his dictatorship in its aftermath. 1937 also witnessed the formation of the political party which would come to dominate Spanish politics until the 1970s. In 1934, in the firmament of Spanish radical politics prior to the outbreak of the Civil War, a new political party, the Falange Española, or Spanish Phalanx, had been established. This was effectively a fascist party in the vein of the National Socialists in Germany. It was far-right, anti-communist, and a champion of the Roman Catholic Church. Franco had not been associated with the Falange in its early years, But in April 1937, he now merged the Fascist Party with a number of other political groupings of the right in Spain, such as the monarchists and ultra-Catholic groupings, to form the Falange Española Tradicionalista y de las Juntas de Ofensiva Nacional Sindicalista, meaning the traditionalist Spanish phalanx of the councils of the National Syndicalist Offensive. Thus, from the summer of 1937, Franco was the undisputed leader of the nationalists. The nationalists were also making headway in securing the more peripheral parts of the country. By early 1937, they controlled the bulk of the west of the country, with key strongholds in Coruña and León in the north, and Sevilla and Granada in the south, while the Republicans retained control of the eastern coastal parts of Spain, the Basque country in the northeast, and the central Meseta region, including Madrid. In 1937, the focus of military operations largely lay in the northeast, in the Basque country, which was secured for the Republican cause in the early months of the war. A concerted effort to secure the area by the nationalists was undertaken in the spring of 1937. The Basque campaign has become infamous for the perpetration of the most notorious atrocity committed in the course of the Spanish Civil War. This was the bombing of the town of Guernica in northern Spain in late April 1937. It was carried out by the Condor Legion, provided by Nazi Germany, and the Legionary Air Force sent to Spain by Italy. Hundreds of Spanish civilians were killed in order to pave the way for Franco's subsequent capture of Bilbao in the region and the securing of northern Spain for the nationalist cause. The number of casualties is a matter of considerable contention, estimates ranging from several hundred to upwards of 1,000. These were largely civilians, and there is little doubting that it constituted a major atrocity by the nationalists. In the aftermath of Guernica, the nationalists made rapid advances in the north and northeast. The regional capital of Bilbao fell to them on the 19th of June 1937, after a 2-month-long siege, and the conquest of the Basque country was completed in October 1937, bringing the nationalists into more secure control of the northeast and the Aragonese countryside further south. The Republicans, however, retained strongholds in the Meseta and all along the Mediterranean coast, including the cities of Barcelona and Valencia. 1938 was the critical year in deciding the outcome of the war. In the closing weeks of 1937, the Republicans attempted to retake the city of Teruel in eastern Aragon, lying inland from the Mediterranean coast, roughly halfway between Barcelona and Valencia. Their goal was twofold. If Teruel could be captured, it would better secure Catalonia for the Republican cause, while it was also believed that a pincer movement into the region would distract Franco from any attempt to take Madrid. The town soon became the focus of an intense confrontation between the Republicans and the nationalists. Both sides flooded the region with well in excess of 100,000 troops each. In the dying weeks of 1937 and the first days of 1938, Franco himself diverted his attentions to Teruel just before Christmas Day 1937. Bloody and intense fighting between December and February would see each side suffer over 60,000 casualties, a death toll which was compounded by the worst winter that Spain had endured in 20 years. The Republicans eventually took the town early in January, before a sustained nationalist counteroffensive reclaimed it in mid-February, bringing the Battle of Teruel to an end. Teruel effectively exhausted the resources of the Republicans and has a significance for the course of the Spanish Civil War, far in excess of the strategic importance of the town itself. In the aftermath of it, Franco wasted little time in taking advantage of having gained the strategic upper hand. In early March, an offensive eastwards towards the Mediterranean coastline was underway, and by April, the nationalists had entered the provinces of Catalonia and Valencia, securing a large stretch of the Mediterranean coastline by mid-April. As a result of this offensive, the Republicans were suing for peace terms by the early summer of 1938 and had been reduced to holding the Meseta eastwards to Valencia and a small isolated pocket of territory in the northeast, centered on Barcelona. The final push came in late 1938 and early 1939. On the 23rd of December 1938, the nationalists invaded Catalonia. Cut off from the main Republican strongholds between Madrid and Valencia, the leftists had little hope here. Tarragona fell on the 15th of January 1939, and a major event occurred on the 26th when Barcelona was taken by Franco's forces, an event which made it clear that the civil war was effectively over. Weeks later, the governments of Britain and France, which had previously tried to avoid officially favoring one side or the other, recognized Franco and the Phalangists as the official government of Spain. The Spanish Civil War was brought to an end in the spring of 1939. On the 6th of March, the Republican Prime Minister Juan Negrin fled to France in the face of an insurrection within the Republican military, which now sued for peace terms. A final military operation by the nationalists began in late March. On the 28th of March, Franco's troops entered Madrid, followed 2 days later by the capitulation of Valencia. On the 1st of April, Franco made a speech which was broadcast via radio throughout Spain, in which he declared victory for the nationalist cause. That same day, the last Republican stronghold, the Mediterranean town of Alicante, surrendered. After nearly 3 years, the Spanish Civil War was over. Franco was now the undisputed ruler of Spain. Franco's first weeks as the unequivocal head of the Spanish state were bloody. Leading historians of the regime estimate that at least 30,000 Republicans were executed in the weeks and months following the cessation of hostilities, while tens of thousands more were imprisoned. Hundreds of thousands more fled from the country, many leaving for South America, and approximately 500,000 streaming over the Pyrenees to France to find refuge there. For years afterwards, such persecution of Republicans and their families would continue. That is one of the greatest crimes of Franco's regime. Although Spain's new leader aspired to rejuvenate the country in the aftermath of the war, he was to be instantly thwarted in this by events elsewhere in Europe, involving his erstwhile allies. Nazi Germany's involvement in the Spanish Civil War had been just one component of a much wider pattern of German aggression throughout Europe during the mid to late 1930s. In March 1936, the Rhineland region of Western Germany was remilitarized. 2 years later, in March 1938, a more aggressive action was taken when Germany effectively annexed Austria into Greater Germany. Then, in early 1939, the rest of Central Europe was brought under Nazi control when parts of Czechoslovakia and Hungary were formed into puppet regimes or annexed. Britain and France had tried to appease Hitler and the Nazis as all of this was occurring. But when Germany invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939, it was a step too far. 2 days later, the governments in London and Paris declared war. One might have assumed that Franco would have been an obvious ally of Nazi Germany and Mussolini's Italy when the Second World War erupted throughout Europe in September 1939. After all, both the Germans and the Italians had provided significant, perhaps crucial support to the Spanish fascists during the Spanish Civil War, and as a result had paved the way for Franco's rise to power. And yet Spain would remain neutral for the most part throughout the conflict. Franco's reasons for not joining the Axis powers during the war were mixed. In the autumn of 1939, the motive was sheer war exhaustion. The Spanish Civil War had only been brought to an end in April 1939, and there was a country to be rebuilt and civil strife to be recovered from when the issue arose of whether to join Hitler and Mussolini in their general war just a few months later. But Franco's stance in this regard shifted considerably in the months ahead, following the lightning-quick conquest of Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries, and France by Germany in the late spring and early summer of 1940. the Spanish dictator indicated to Hitler in mid-June 1940 that he was willing to join the war. Negotiations to this effect were held at Hendaye, in southern France on the 23rd of October 1940, between Franco and Hitler. But here the German Chancellor balks at Franco's demands for supplies from Germany and a promise of future control of Gibraltar and French North Africa. Once these early negotiations to bring Spain directly into the war on the side of the Axis powers failed, Franco generally steered an opportunistic politique course for the remainder of the war. For instance, he sanctioned the formation of a unit of Spanish volunteers to serve in the German war effort, but strictly stipulated that this Blue Division was only to be allowed to serve on the Eastern Front against Soviet Russia, as he did not wish to damage Spain's relations with the US and Britain. Similarly, Spanish troops were stationed in the Pyrenees from 1941 onwards to prevent against any attempt by Hitler to occupy the Iberian Peninsula for strategic reasons. More revealingly, Franco shifted his stance as the course of the war altered in 1942 and 1943, with the German armies having been stopped on the Eastern Front and then forced into a retreat back towards Poland and Germany by the advancing Soviet Red Army. Franco saw that Hitler and his allies were doomed and accordingly began engaging in a more strict neutrality and was increasingly accommodating of the Allies from 1943 onwards. Allied troops who were downed in France in air missions could flee to Spain and were given safe passage back to their respective countries from the Iberian Peninsula. This certainly gained the appreciation of both the British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, and the US President, Franklin D. Roosevelt at the time. But Franco was not so well liked in the aftermath of the war by the Western powers. In the aftermath of the global conflict, Spain was not invited to join the newly established United Nations, owing to the sympathetic stance it had displayed towards Nazi Germany during the war, and the country under Franco was ultimately excluded from that international body until 1955. Once the Second World War concluded in 1945, Spain finally found itself free of either its own civil war being fought internally or a global war raging everywhere around it for the first time in nearly a decade. Indeed, the 30 years between 1945 and Franco's death in 1975 was, despite the dictatorship, arguably the most protracted period of political stability enjoyed by Spain since the 18th century. Francoist Spain, as it is known, was ruled by Franco as the supreme head of state, who took on the title of Caudillo de España, meaning the leader of Spain. There was little doubting that this was, in essence, a dictatorship. But it was one which became more optimistic in the aftermath of the Second World War. And although Franco courted the support of Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy at the time of the Spanish Civil War, Franco cannot really be termed an ideological fascist himself. His was a military dictatorship, one which sought to foster the core values of the conservative movement, which had formed one part of Spain's political landscape since the 19th century, specifically nationalism, support for the Roman Catholic Church, and an opposition to leftist politics, particularly socialists and communists. The Falange Española, which Franco had formed out of the various right-wing Spanish political parties in 1937, was the sole legal party in the country between the conclusion of the Civil War in 1939 and the end of the Franco regime in the 1970s. But there was also a distinct drift away from the party's fascist roots of the 1930s during the post-war period, symbolized in the rebranding of the Falange as the Movimiento Nacional, or National Movement, in 1958. Yet this is not to suggest that Franco did not engage in harsh political repression. Trade unionism and left-leaning political organizations were generally monitored and suppressed, while many socialist organizations were banned by the state. Similarly, Franco's regime sought to impose a harsh suppression of the many regional separatist movements in areas such as the Basque Country and Catalonia, which have so characterized the history of modern Spain. Such policies, though, were only so effective. Indeed, in some instances, they proved counterproductive. Attempts to curb Basque separatism, for instance, simply eventuated in the formation of the Euskadi Askatasuna organization, or ETA for short, in 1959, meaning Basque Homeland and Liberty. ETA developed in the 1960s into a terrorist paramilitary organization, bent on using bombings, assassinations, and kidnappings to pressure the Spanish state in order to gain independence for the Basque region in northern Spain. Other authoritarian policies have cast a shadow over the Franco regime. Surely one of the most heinous aspects of Franco's dictatorship was the abduction of the children of Spanish Republicans and their fostering out to nationalist families. Much of the goal here was a form of social engineering, whereby these children, who would most likely be raised as left-leaning socialists and Republicans if they remained in their original family units, would now be raised as conservatives and traditionalists, in line with the political ideologies of the Francoist regime. This practice had started during the Civil War, often involving children whose parents had been killed during the conflict, but it intensified to soon involve the children of Republicans who were arrested and imprisoned. It continued into the 1940s, before petering out in the 1950s, and eventually involved tens of thousands of children, perhaps into the hundreds of thousands. Many of these children never knew the circumstances of their birth or were never repatriated to their parents, and the legacy of what has been termed the lost children of Francoism was undoubtedly one of the worst crimes perpetuated by Franco's dictatorship. Elsewhere in the 1940s and 1950s, the powerful position of the Roman Catholic Church throughout Spanish society was cemented through Franco's policies. The Church's close alliance with Franco ensured that it was given almost complete control over the country's educational system, including Spain's universities, where lecturers and professors were screened for their Catholic credentials. And in Spanish society, divorce, contraception, and abortions were all prohibited. Most oppressive was the treatment of women in Spanish society. The Second Republic had adopted many of the progressive measures which had developed for women's rights in the United Kingdom and elsewhere. But these laws were now repealed, and women were increasingly confined to traditional roles in the 1940s and 1950s. As a result, women in Spain were prohibited from working in many professions and needed the permission of a husband or male relative to do something as simple as open a bank account. The middle years of the Franco regime in the late 1950s also saw considerable changes in Spain's colonial possessions in North Africa. In 1956, the French-held parts of Morocco gained independence, and the Spanish state simultaneously agreed to relinquish some of the territory it had acquired in northwest Africa nearly a half-century earlier. Yet this did not prevent conflict erupting between Franco's Spain and the Morocco of Sultan Mohammed V in 1957. The Ifni War, as it has become known, dragged on for 8 months into the summer of 1958 and resulted in Spain ceding Tarifaya to Morocco. Further territory would be ceded in subsequent years, and the Spanish colonies in the Gulf of Guinea were granted independence as Equatorial Guinea in 1968, whilst in 1975, shortly before Franco's death, a withdrawal began from the extensive territory known as Spanish Sahara, the sovereignty of which is still contested today between Morocco and Mauritania. Yet some small enclaves in northwestern Africa have been retained down to the present day, notably the cities of Ceuta and Melilla in northern Morocco. There were ambiguities to all this as time passed and the memory of the Civil War faded, and the regime became more liberal. The White Terror, as the Francoist oppression of the Republicans, both during and immediately after the war has become known, petered out gradually in the 1940s, though much of this was owing to the regime simply no longer having any enemies at home to persecute. Concentration camps, which had been set up to hold Republican prisoners in the late 1930s, gradually disappeared from Spain. The last one, that at Miranda de Ebro near Burgos, was closed in 1947. By way of contrast, from the late 1950s onwards, and in particular during the 1960s, unofficially sanctioned trade unions began to operate in Spain and were not crushed or clamped down on in the manner which they almost certainly would have been had they tried to operate in the 1940s. In other ways, Spanish society was undergoing some limited liberalization from the late 1950s onwards. For instance, some of the restrictions on what women could or could not do were relaxed in the 1960s. Censorship of the press and the media also became less severe in the last 15 or so years of Franco's dictatorship, although any overt criticism of the regime itself remained a crime. Much of this must be viewed in light of the country's drift into the Western capitalist bloc of states led by the United States during the Cold War from 1955 onwards. As Spain found common ground with these countries, Franco became less authoritarian at home and more inclined to liberalize certain aspects of Spanish society. The ambiguities of Franco's dictatorship are most clearly evident when examining his economic policy. It is impossible to dismiss the success of Spain's economy during Franco's tenure as the Spanish head of state. Ever since the late 17th century, the country had languished in a state of seemingly perpetual economic backwardness, with a lack of industry and an over-reliance on unproductive farming methods carried out on large estates. All of this was compounded by the devastation caused by the Spanish Civil War, and for much of the 1940s, the country was on the brink of bankruptcy, with only a meager economic recovery occurring. However, from the late 1950s, economic growth took off to such an extent that the last 15 or so years of Franco's regime has been dubbed the Spanish Miracle, or El Milagro Español. In economic terms, during these years, the country had the second fastest growing economy in the world. Only Japan, which was undergoing its own economic miracle, grew at a faster rate between the late 1950s and the early 1970s. The Spanish miracle came about owing to a combination of factors, not least a series of national development plans devised by Franco's ministers and the adoption of a free market economy in 1959. Iron and steel factories proliferated in the northern provinces, and these, in turn, supplied raw materials for a thriving shipbuilding industry in the ports of the northern coast. Petrochemicals became a major national industry, and new corporations emerged, notably the Seat Automobile Company. In 1946, there were just over 70,000 private cars in Spain. This number had increased to over 1 million cars 20 years later. More than 750,000 Seat cars were produced during the years of the Spanish miracle. As a result of all this, Spain went from being one of the most economically backward countries in Western Europe to being the world's 9th largest economy by the end of Franco's regime. Thereafter, the global economic recession of the mid to late 1970s saw Spain's economic growth stall. But there is no doubting but the Spanish miracle hauled the country's economy out of the stagnation in which it had wallowed for 2 centuries and brought it into the 20th century. This, combined with the massive expansion of the tourism sector in the post-Franco period, created the economy of modern Spain. And whatever his other failings and crimes may have been, this must be acknowledged as a major success of Franco's time in power. Perhaps in assessing Franco's career and the nature of his regime, we should also consider that he did not work to ensure the continuity of his dictatorship. This might have been partly owing to his lack of a male heir. Franco's marriage produced just one child. His daughter, Maria del Carmen, born in 1926, had the caudillo had a male heir to pass the dictatorship to, he might have made provision to ensure that this occurred. But he didn't. Indeed, Franco had taken steps to restore the Spanish monarchy as early as 1947, when an official referendum was held to make Spain a monarchy once again. Although it was passed, no new king was crowned at that time, and Franco instead had his powers as a regent for life ratified. As he neared the end of his life, though, he took more concerted steps to restore the monarchy, culminating in 1969 when Juan Carlos of the old royal house of Bourbon was named as Franco's successor and made it prince. 2 years earlier, steps had been taken to allow freer elections to the Spanish legislature. Then, in 1973, Franco resigned his position as Premier of Spain and head of the government in favor of Luis Carrero Blanco. Blanco was a long-standing ally of Franco's, who had fought with the Generalissimo in North Africa in the 1920s and during the Spanish Civil War, but his tenure as Prime Minister was short-lived, as he was killed by a roadside bomb by the Basque terrorist group ETA in the final days of 1973. 2 further individuals, Torquato Fernández Miranda and Carlos Arias Navarro, would subsequently serve as Prime Ministers of Spain before Franco's death. But despite this partial relinquishing of power, Franco retained many of his positions, still serving as head of state, albeit in a much more limited capacity, and also retaining control over the Spanish military. Nevertheless, the measures taken from the late 1960s constituted some significant steps towards transitioning towards a less authoritarian regime. And at the end of Franco's life and following his death, the country would quickly transition to a democracy. This would come in the mid-1970s. By the late 1960s, Franco was approaching 80 years of age. His health was declining considerably. This worsened into the 1970s, in part because the Spanish dictator was suffering from Parkinson's disease. In 1974, he was sufficiently incapacitated on a number of occasions that his duties were passed in part to Prince Juan Carlos. His last official engagement occurred on the 1st of October 1975, when he gave a speech in Madrid, whereat he was said to have been particularly frail-looking. 4 weeks later, he fell into a coma and was put on a life support machine. There is some dispute as to whether he died on the 19th of November or in the early hours of the 20th, either from a heart attack or septic shock. His body was buried in the Valley of the Fallen, a huge burial tomb near Madrid, which had been constructed as a mausoleum and a memorial to those who had died in the Civil War, though it has recently been exhumed from here and removed to a family crypt on the outskirts of the Spanish capital. Although he professed a commitment to maintaining the system Franco had created and overseen for over 35 years, Juan Carlos moved to rapidly dismantle the authoritarian Francoist state as soon as the Caudillo died in the early winter of 1975. A constitutional monarchy was established in the 3 years that followed. On the 15th of June 1977, the first free and open general election to have been held in Spain since 1936 took place, returning a high number of centrist and left-wing delegates to parliament, an indication of the shift away from the right-wing politics of the Franco era. A year and a half later, a new constitution was ratified in December 1978. This has become the basis of Spain's modern constitutional monarchy, the total failure of an attempted coup d'etat in February 1981 by elements within the Spanish military who wished to see a restoration of authoritarianism in Spain was indicative of how quickly the country had successfully transitioned into a liberal democracy in the years immediately following Franco's death. General Francisco Franco is perhaps the most ambiguous of the dictators who seized power throughout Europe in the mid-20th century. He came to power as a result of a bloody civil war in which the conservative military bloc, which he led, was forever tarnished through a series of atrocities such as occurred in Guernica in April 1937, and through its associations with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. In the 1930s and 1940s in particular, Franco's regime was responsible for the killing, arrest, or drastic interference in the lives of millions of Spanish civilians. This was especially the case in the aftermath of the Civil War, when the Spanish courts were dealing in the summary conviction and execution of hundreds of Republicans every day for months on end. Any assessment of his career must start by acknowledging this terrible legacy. But there is also little doubting that the Franco regime changed over time. In particular, As it entered the 1950s, Francoist Spain became less repressive and, switching from an overt totalitarianism to a less brutal authoritarianism, there were also a number of considerable advances in Spanish society in the last 2 decades or so of Franco's regime, with the growing affinity with the US Western Bloc of powers from 1955, when the country was admitted to the United Nations. Most significantly, the Spanish economic miracle, which occurred between 1959 and the mid-1970s, finally hauled Spain out of the economic malaise it had been languishing in since the 18th century, and made it one of the world's ascendant economic powerhouses. This created economic opportunities and prosperity for the Spanish working and middle class, which was unparalleled up to that point in modern Spanish history. This certainly does not excuse Franco's crimes, but it should be considered in any balanced appraisal of his time in power. And then there is the character of Franco himself. Who or what was he? He was an exceptionally private man, and the real Francisco Franco is hard to identify. Perhaps he might best be defined as a product of Spain itself, and one who shifted his own political stances in line with the prevailing trends of European and global politics between the 1930s and the 1970s. In the years leading up to the Civil War, he was a staunch advocate of Spanish conservatism, one of the 2 prevailing political stances in the country since the early 19th century. In this respect, he was an ardent anti-communist, a feature which was perhaps the most consistent aspect of his political views throughout his 4 decades in power. However, despite his ties to Hitler and Mussolini, Francisco Franco was not really a fascist, and in the course of the 1950s, the regime softened its stances considerably, eventually drifting towards closer ties with the US and the Western European states, as the Cold War made the right-wing Spanish regime a natural ally. Thus, Franco adapted to fit the prevailing political winds. Perhaps this was who he was in the end, a political chameleon, born of the chaos of Spanish politics in the age of extremes, which characterized Europe in the first half of the 20th century. What do you think of General Franco? Should we view him entirely in light of his brutal takeover of Spain in the 1930s, or did his later rule substantially rehabilitate him from his earlier crimes? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. The man known to history as Benito Mussolini was born on the 29th of July 1883 in the small town of Dovia di Predapio in the Emilia-Romagna region of central Italy. His full baptismal name was Benito Amilcare Andrea Mussolini. Amilcare comes from Hamilcar, the given name of a Carthaginian general of the 3rd century BC, who was one of the Roman Republic's great nemeses during the era of the Punic Wars, and the father of Hannibal, who famously marched over the Alps to strike at Rome during the Second Punic War. The Carthaginian middle name is a somewhat ironic one for Mussolini to have had, given that he later viewed himself as a leader who was restoring Italy to the greatness it had enjoyed in Roman times. Benito's father was Alessandro Mussolini, a blacksmith who was very interested in politics and engaged in revolutionary socialist movements in Italy from a young age. He spent several years in the late 1870s and early 1880s under a form of house arrest as a result of his political activities, and was only given his liberty a year before Benito's birth. Benito's mother was Rosa Maldoni. She and Alessandro had just married in 1882, and Benito was their first child. 2 others, another boy named Arnaldo, and a daughter whom they named Edvige, followed in 1885 and 1888. Rosa worked as a schoolteacher and was also a politically conscious woman. She and Alessandro named their eldest son after Benito Juarez, the president of Mexico for much of the period between 1858 and 1872, who had led the liberal resistance in the country to the French intervention in its politics and the establishment of Maximilian Habsburg as Emperor of Mexico between 1864 and 1867. Mussolini would grow up in a country that was experiencing mixed fortunes. The Kingdom of Italy had only come into existence in 1861, after centuries of the peninsula being divided up into city-states of varying size. It managed to quickly acquire further territory in the north from Austria during a brief war in 1866, and then Rome was captured from the papacy in 1870 after French troops were withdrawn there following the outbreak of the Franco-Prussian War. On top of this, the country was able to emerge between the 1880s and the 1910s as one of the major European colonial powers, acquiring control of large parts of the Horn of Africa, as well as gaining concessions in the ports of China. In 1911, control was also established over Libya, while the following year, the eastern Mediterranean island of Rhodes was secured from the Ottoman Empire. At home, the country's politics was fairly liberal and progressive, with a mix of Christian Democrats, socialists, and liberals holding power from 1861 down to 1914. However, there were problems too. Italy was one of the most densely populated parts of Europe upon unification in 1861, and large parts of the peninsula, especially in the south and on the islands, were incredibly poor. Successive governments failed to address the economic problems of the state, and emigration levels were enormously high between 1861 and 1914, leading to somewhere in the region of 15 million Italians leaving their homeland for the United States, Argentina, and other countries, an indictment of Italy's inability to provide opportunities of any kind for so many of its citizens. Mussolini was strongly influenced by his parents in his early political outlook, particularly his father's views on republicanism and socialism. He attended two different schools in the Emilia-Romagna region at Faenza and Forlimpopoli. At both he clashed with his teachers and was eventually removed from the first at Faenza owing to his violent behavior, a development which disappointed his mother, a devout Roman Catholic, who had sent him to Faenza to be educated by the monks there. He was then sent to Forlimpopoli, where he also ran into difficulty. Nevertheless, he was acknowledged as being an intelligent child, and when he was just 18 years old in 1901, he managed to graduate with a diploma to become a schoolteacher at the elementary level. Beyond this, his more unofficial education was obtained in his father's forge, where father and son often conversed about a wide range of political ideas, notably socialism and the anarchism which was emanating from Russia and other places at the time. In the summer of 1902, Mussolini delivered a public speech on the 20th anniversary of the death of Giuseppe Garibaldi, the leader of the Wars of Italian Unification a half a century earlier. Despite obtaining a diploma to work as a teacher, Mussolini soon discovered that he had little interest in his mother's profession. Instead, he was drawn to writing and politics, and decided to become a journalist, a profession which combined the two. He did so initially from Switzerland, where he relocated to in 1902 in order to avoid compulsory military service in Italy. In the Alpine country, he became a committed socialist and began to run into legal difficulty for his role in organizing worker strikes there. He eventually returned home late in 1904 and undertook his military service over the next 2 years, a homecoming which sadly was followed not long after by the premature death of his mother at 46 years of age from meningitis. From 1909 onwards, he was living in the Alpine city of Trento, in what is now northern Italy, but which was then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Here he worked for a local socialist party and as a journalist, while also continuing to read widely. His politics were largely those of communists and socialists, and he taught himself German in order to read the works of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, the co-authors of the Communist Manifesto. In a sign of just how different his early politics were to those of the older Mussolini, he protested against the Italian invasion of Libya in 1911. He was undoubtedly a communist during these years. He was also extremely well-read and a prolific writer, often producing work under the nom de guerre vero eretico, meaning sincere heretic or true heretic. When the First World War broke out in the summer of 1914, Mussolini was initially opposed to Italian entry into it. The Italian government of the day, despite its long-standing alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary, took a similar view and remained neutral for the time being. When it did finally enter the war in 1915, it did so on the side of Britain, France and Russia, the primary goal being to obtain lands from Austria-Hungary, which many Italians considered to be Italian sovereign territory. Mussolini soon changed his mind as well. In November 1914, he founded a newspaper, Il Popolo d'Italia, the People of Italy, in Milan, one which took a pro-war stance. This volte-face in his views on the war saw Mussolini expelled from the Italian Socialist Party. This period was the critical one in terms of his shifting political stance. And Benito now founded a new political party. He named it the Fascio Rivoluzionario d'Azione Internazionalista, meaning revolutionary fasces of international action. The term fascist comes from an old Latin term for a bundle of rods or a sheaf. In the Kingdom of Italy in the late 19th century, it had emerged as a term to describe a strong, united group of political actors. It is from this which the term fascism would ultimately derive, and Mussolini's followers soon became known as fascisti, or fascists. In line with his newfound emphasis on nationalism and socialism, Mussolini volunteered for military service. After some initial reservations about calling him up owing to his history as a revolutionary socialist, he was drafted at the end of August 1915 and would fight in several engagements against the Austro-Hungarians along the Isonzo River at what is now the border between Italy and Slovenia. He was commended for his service between 1915 and early 1917 and promoted to the rank of corporal. His war ended when a mortar shell exploded near him in a trench, wounding him considerably and leaving him with dozens of shards of metal in his body. Throughout this period, he became more and more disillusioned with his previous beliefs in revolutionary socialism of the communist variety, and now moved towards a more extreme nationalist bent. Thus, as the war was coming to an end, Mussolini began advocating for a revitalization of Italy to become a great power and to acquire spazio vitale, literally meaning living space. The idea that Italy should expand to conquer land around the Mediterranean Sea, which the Roman Empire had once ruled over. The idea would later be paralleled in the Nazi concept of acquiring Lebensraum in Eastern Europe. In this, Mussolini was influenced by Giuseppe Bottai, a figure he met in 1919, and who would be a major figure in the conceptualization of Italian fascism. The years of the First World War were also important in Mussolini's personal life. Around the time the war broke out, he had married Ida d'Alser, the daughter of a former mayor of Trento, who had studied cosmetics in Paris. They probably met in Trento while Mussolini was working there, and she subsequently relocated to Milan with him, with Ida often supporting him financially, based on her family's wealth and her work as a beautician. The marriage did not last long. They divorced in 1915, though not before she fell pregnant and gave birth to Benito Albino. Benito Sr.'s subsequent treatment of his first wife and son was appalling. He did not support them in any way, and after he came to power in 1922, he had them placed under police observation as he repeatedly denied ever having been married to d'Alser. He also had records of their marriage systematically destroyed, though one court record has survived in the Milanese archive that proves that they were married. Eventually, Ida died living in semi-house arrest in 1937 under suspicious circumstances, while Benito Albino was placed in an asylum on account of his repeated claims to be Mussolini's son. He died there in 1942. As soon as he divorced Ida in 1915, Mussolini married Rachele Guidi, his mistress of several years, and the mother of his daughter Edda, born in 1910. She hailed from Predappio as well, and her widowed mother had been in a relationship with Benito's father after his mother died in 1905. They would have 4 further children, 3 sons, Vittorio, Bruno, and Romano, and another daughter, Anna Maria, born between 1916 and 1929. In the immediate aftermath of the First World War, there was a strong view held by many people in Italy that they had been betrayed in the peace settlements that followed between 1919 and 1922. This quickly became known as the mutilated victory, after a term coined by the prominent Italian writer and politician Gabriele D'Annunzio. Italy had entered the war in 1915 on the side of Britain, France, and Russia, on the basis that it would receive a considerable amount of territory from the Austro-Hungarian Empire once the conflict was over, specifically lands in the Alpine South Tyrol, bordering northern Italy, and along the Istria and Dalmatian coast on the eastern side of the Adriatic, where Slovenia, Croatia, and Italy meet today. These were lands which many viewed as intrinsically part of historic Italy. Many Italian nationalists also sought control over Albania, a country which had been ruled by Italian powers at various times in the ancient and medieval past. Some of these demands were met in the peace negotiations, but Albania became an independent country once again, and Italy did not receive all the territory it had sought on the eastern side of the Adriatic, some of which instead went to the Kingdom of Croats, Serbs, and Slovenes that would later become Yugoslavia. This, along with the country's enduring economic problems, meant that while Italy was one of the victorious powers in the First World War, it did not feel that way for many Italians. Mussolini's nascent fascist movement evolved quickly between 1919 and 1922 to take advantage of this sense of Italian alienation. In March 1919, he founded the Fasci Italiani di Combattimento in Milan, which transliterates as Italian Fighting Bands, a clear sign of the shift towards a more militant politics. They soon were forming squadrismo, squads of black-shirted paramilitaries, or squadristi, who, in the febrile atmosphere of Italian and European politics in the post-war era, attacked people of Slavic heritage in Italian cities and towns, the perceived enemy of Italy in the contested Adriatic coastal regions. In a striking sign of Mussolini's break from his radical socialist past, the Black Shirts were also soon involved in running battles with communists in northern Italy, notably during a general strike in Milan in 1920. The Black Shirts were the first of numerous fascist paramilitary organizations that would appear in Europe over the next decade or so, others being the SA Brown Shirts of the Nazis, the Black Shirts of Oswald Mosley in Britain, and the Green Shirts of the Yugoslav Radical Union in the Balkans. The Black Shirts in Italy would remain a feature of Mussolini's organizations even after he established a new party again in 1921. This was one known as the Partito Nazionale Fascista, or National Fascist Party. It would be the first fascist party to seize power anywhere in Europe. What is perhaps most striking about Mussolini's movement is the speed with which he managed to secure power. The National Fascist Party was established in November 1921, and less than a year later, Mussolini was in charge of Italy. In the 1921 general election, while still campaigning as the Fasci Italiani di Combattimento, Mussolini and his followers had won 35 seats in a general election as part of the wider national bloc. The same election ended in a deeply divided parliament, and Italy's unstable post-war politics continued. Indeed, the situation became worse as Mussolini began engaging in a fascist insurgency, whereby he sought to destabilize the country and present his National Fascist Party as the most suitable option to stabilize the situation. Matters boiled over into disorder in August 1922, when Mussolini's Black Shirts effectively seized control of Milan, attacking socialist organizations all over the city and appointing their own members to municipal offices. When the national government in Rome did little to stop him in Milan, Mussolini was emboldened. He now began preparing to march on Rome, principally from Milan, but also ordering units of squadristi to do so from Naples and other towns and cities. The march on Rome commenced on the 28th of October 1922 and would end 3 days later, with somewhere over 25,000 Black Shirts involved. Mussolini himself did not lead the march, though he did appear at critical junctures to be opportunely photographed as though he did. It all had the desired effect. King Victor Emmanuel III appointed Mussolini as the new Prime Minister of Italy on the 30th of October. The following day, the Black Shirts parading through the Eternal City, he formed the first fascist government the world had ever seen. Mussolini did not immediately acquire dictatorial powers. It was a gradual process in the first 2 or 3 years that he was in office. A number of events helped him consolidate his control over Italy. In August 1923, an Italian diplomat named Enrico Tellini was killed while adjudicating on a border dispute between Greece and Albania. Mussolini responded by invading the Greek island of Corfu in September. He subsequently relinquished control of the island, but extorted 50 million lira off the Greek government in return for doing so, while the Corfu incident also helped quell Greek calls for the return of Rhodes and the other Dodecanese islands in Italian possession. It hugely bolstered Mussolini's reputation in Italy, seemingly proving that a fascist leader was capable of asserting a strong Italian international presence. Just 2 months after this, the Acerbo Law was passed, which dictated that the party which received the most votes in an Italian election would receive 2/3 of the parliamentary seats. This was employed when a new election was held in April 1924. While the election itself was somewhat fair, the application of the wildly undemocratic Acerbo Law In short, Mussolini completely controlled the parliament that resulted from it. Finally, in 1926, all other political parties other than Mussolini's National Fascist Party were banned, completing the transition to a one-party dictatorship. In line with this, Mussolini increasingly became known as Il Duce, the leader, a title which Adolf Hitler would later adopt in Germany, though using the Germanic Führer. The question arises from all of this as to what extent Mussolini was the architect of European fascism, an ideology that would be adopted by a wide range of countries across Europe in the 1930s. There is no denying that Mussolini was a pivotal figure in this, not simply because it was he that led the National Fascist Party and the Black Shirts to power, but also because he wrote extensively on the topic in numerous essays and books in the 1920s and 1930s. Most notably, The Doctrine of Fascism, an essay he produced in 1927. Yet others were just as significant. Notably, the political philosopher Giovanni Gentile, who served as the Minister for Education early on in Mussolini's government. Gentile composed a work entitled Manifesto of the Fascist Intellectuals in 1925, following the Conference of Fascist Culture in Bologna that March, and many other Italian intellectuals signed it. He was also probably involved in writing the first draft of Mussolini's Doctrine of Fascism. There were numerous others who were just as involved in the origins of fascism. For instance, though he would come to oppose Mussolini's regime, Gabriele D'Annunzio, the prominent political figure and writer who devised the concept of a mutilated victory for Italy after the First World War, was a major inspiration for Mussolini's ideas. One element of fascist movements seen elsewhere in Europe, which Mussolini was most certainly the creator of, was the concept of a fascist secret police. In 1927, as he continued his consolidation of power, Mussolini established the Opera Vigilanza Repressione Antifascismo, the Organization for Vigilance and Repression of Anti-Fascism. This forerunner of the Gestapo in Germany would eventually grow to about 50,000 operatives and was responsible for carrying out thousands of raids and interviews every week at the height of their efforts to crush any activities they deemed anti-fascist. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the Nazi SS, would subsequently visit Italy to see the OVRA in action. Not everyone looking on at the development of the Italian police state in the 1920s and 1930s was appalled. For instance, Winston Churchill, the future wartime leader of Britain, expressed some admiration for what Mussolini had achieved in bringing stability to Italy and reducing lawlessness, as did many other international leaders. A part of this was owing to the manner in which Mussolini and the Italian fascists seemed to have bridled the mafia in Sicily, with Mussolini's appointee Cesare Mori overseeing an immensely successful campaign of repression against the Sicilian crime syndicate between 1925 and 1929. Another element of European fascism which Mussolini pioneered was the development of a cult of personality. His public image was carefully cultivated. Newspapers and other elements of the Italian media were closely censored to present a particular view of him, and a popular phrase of the time was "Il Duce ha sempre ragione." The leader is always right. Mussolini's relatively young age when he seized power, he being still in his late 30s when the March on Rome occurred, was made note of in fascist propaganda, and his perceived athleticism became a feature of the personality cult around him. This in turn fed into the encouragement of fascist youth organizations, while sport became a particular element of fascist concern in Italy. In 1928, work commenced on the Foro Mussolini in central Rome, today's Foro Italico. Modeled on the forums built by the Roman emperors in central Rome, Mussolini's forum was a giant sports complex, complete with stadiums, tennis courts, and other facilities. Mussolini hoped to hold the 1940 Summer Olympics here, though in the end, these games, which were ultimately cancelled, were awarded to Tokyo. In 1934, the FIFA World Cup was held in Italy. It proved to be a major boon to Mussolini's regime, as Italy won the tournament at home, defeating Czechoslovakia in the final. The team followed up their success when they retained their title in France in 1938. Legend has it that Mussolini telegrammed the team in Paris before the final against Hungary with a message saying, "Win or die." Many other aspects of Italian culture were employed by Mussolini's fascist government to galvanize their own position, most notably the country's history and culture, with a very conscious effort being made to tie the new Italy to the power of the Roman Empire 2 millennia earlier. As much as sport, propaganda, or any cult of personality might have improved the image of the fascist government, a powerful way for Mussolini to forge support for his position was to create good economic circumstances. The fascists had largely come to power in 1922 because of the economic and political chaos which had enveloped Italy for several years after the war. Mussolini benefited enormously from the fact that he came to power just as the European economy as a whole was beginning to stabilize and enter a period of enormous economic growth, the Roaring Twenties. The fascists favored a corporatist economic system, one which sought to promote and develop the Italian economy over the importation of foreign goods. This led Mussolini to engage in protectionist measures, such as the imposition of high tariffs on foreign imports, in order to promote domestic industry. Some measures during the era had lasting benefits, most notably the draining of the Pontine Marshes, a large swamp south of Rome, which had been a breeding ground for malaria in central Italy for thousands of years. From the late 1920s onwards, a policy of draining these extensive lands and creating model new towns like Latina, Pontinia, and Pomezia was undertaken. It was an immensely successful initiative. Nevertheless, more broadly, the Great Depression hit Italy just as badly as the rest of Europe, giving the lie to the 1930s myth that fascism was a more effective economic system. Ultimately, Mussolini ordered the mass state takeover of the Italian economy, and it would take until the mid-1950s before Italy returned to the economic output seen in 1929, before the Depression began. Throughout these years, Mussolini still continued to play the part of a happily married man, and his second wife Rachele would remain married and devoted to him until his death in 1945. However, he was a serial philanderer, one who had a great many mistresses over the years, and probably a huge number of casual partners. One of the more famous was Margherita Sarfatti, a prominent Jewish Italian art critic and journalist who wrote a biography of Mussolini in the mid-1920s, shortly after he came to power. We can get a sense of how many others there were from the fact that Mussolini is known to have sired at least 9 illegitimate children, with 8 different mistresses. Mussolini's last illegitimate child, Elena Curti, only passed away in 2022 at the age of 99. An important part of Mussolini's approach towards government was the aim of building Italy into a great power and rectifying the perceived injustice the country had suffered at the end of the First World War. One of the resentments held by many Italian nationalists was that, unlike Britain and France, Italy had not received control over mandated League of Nations territories, such as Germany's former African colonies, or the lands of the Ottoman Empire in the Levant. Mussolini would seek to remedy this by solidifying Italian control over its existing colonies and expanding them where possible. He began in Libya, a large colony in the Maghreb, which Italy had acquired nominal control over in 1911, but which remained unstable. Between 1923 and 1932, the pacification of Libya was engaged in liberal policies that had been adopted after the First World War were announced, and ethnic laws were introduced that, for instance, forbade intermarriage between Italians and the Arab and Berber natives. Thousands of Italian colonists were also brought in. A fierce war of resistance was then engaged in by the natives, one which led to the use of chemical weapons, mass murder, and the development of a concentration camp system by Mussolini's regime. Huge numbers of Bedouin and Berber people were also moved from their traditional homelands and resettled as part of a program of genocide and ethnic cleansing. In all, around 50,000 natives are understood to have been killed by the Italian government during the pacification of Libya, though precise figures are hard to establish for a country where demographic records were extremely limited in the early 20th century. Once the pacification of Libya was completed in the early 1930s, Mussolini turned his attentions to the Horn of Africa. Here, Italy had two colonies that were in relatively close proximity to one another, but divided geographically. These were Italian Somaliland, corresponding closely to modern-day Somalia, and lying on the Indian Ocean side of the Horn of Africa, and Italian Eritrea, a colony lying on the Red Sea end of the region. Between them lay French and British colonial enclaves and the Ethiopian Empire, or Abyssinia, virtually the only native polity in Africa not to have been colonized between 1870 and 1914. The Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931 and the establishment of the puppet state of Manchu Kuo had badly damaged the League of Nations' remit to protect the national independence of sovereign states. And so the Italians invaded Ethiopia in October 1935, with little concern for the potential international backlash. The Second Italo-Ethiopian War was fought over a period of nearly a year and a half, down to the spring of 1937. In the course of it, the Italians would eventually conquer Abyssinia, though with considerable difficulty, and the campaign pointed towards weaknesses in the Italian military that would become glaringly obvious in the years ahead, when they faced British and Commonwealth troops in North Africa. Both the Italians and the Ethiopians engaged in a wide range of breaches of international law in the conflict, using mustard gas, dum-dum bullets, and engaging in massacres of civilians. The Abyssinia conflict was something of a nail in the coffin for the League of Nations, and also demonstrated that the world had moved into a new era of conflict and breaches of international law. The Italians' campaigns of genocide and ethnic cleansing in both Libya and Ethiopia in the 1920s and 1930s raises questions about Mussolini's racial views. They were different to those espoused by the Nazis in Germany. Hitler and his followers adhered to a very systematic racial hierarchy, which held that there were pure races like the Nordic and Aryan peoples of Northern and Central Europe that were racially superior to others, like the Slavic people of Eastern Europe. Mussolini had little time for this rigid system of classification. He was on record many times as saying that the idea of pure races within Western and Central Europe, parts of the continent where people had intermarried and moved between countries over thousands of years, was somewhat nonsensical. However, he did adhere to some elements of this. For instance, because Eastern Europe was divided culturally, socially, and politically from Western Europe through most of the medieval and early modern eras, he did accept that the Slavic people were different to the peoples of Western Europe, and was more than willing later to exploit this racial view of the Slavs to make claims on territory in the Balkans for Italy. Elsewhere, he was nowhere near as anti-Semitic as Hitler or the Nazis in general, even being on record as praising the contribution of Jewish Italians to the country's war effort between 1915 and 1918, while he also had several Jewish lovers. The Italian fascist regime would only begin to adopt anti-Semitic policies in the late 1930s once it allied with Germany. Yet where Mussolini's racial views were very clear was when it came to black people almost anywhere. He regularly made statements about how white Americans would be overtaken by black communities in the United States, and spoke about disparate birth rates between white and black people in Europe and the Americas. Thus, where Mussolini's racial views were most prominent was when it came to white and black ethnic groups. This in part explains the particularly brutal nature of the pacification of Libya and the Second Italo-Ethiopian War. Mussolini did involve Italy in another conflict during these years. In the summer of 1936, while the fighting was still going on in Ethiopia, the Spanish Civil War erupted after a failed coup in the country. It pitted a right-wing nationalist faction against a left-leaning Republican army. Through a series of deaths of more senior commanders, General Francisco Franco would end up as the leader of the nationalists in the course of the war, and the regime he would eventually establish is generally considered a fascist one, though skewing more towards corporatism, a subtle distinction within the politics of the era. Throughout the 2.5 years it was fought, down to the victory of Franco and the nationalists early in 1939, a wide range of European powers contributed forces and aid to one side or the other, as it became a proxy war between fascism and communism in Europe. Mussolini was a particularly avid supporter of Franco, his view being that it would be best to have a closely allied fascist regime in Spain, so that right-wing governments had substantial control over the Western Mediterranean. The Royal Italian Navy played a particularly important role in the conflict, helping the nationalists to break a Republican blockade of nationalist territory in Spain's Moroccan colonies. The Italian Corpo Truppe Volontarie, a force of Italian volunteers or irregulars, also made a major contribution to the nationalist victory, reaching 50,000 men at its height. The Spanish Civil War was significant in also being the first episode during which Mussolini was closely aligned with Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. Both fascist states provided aid to Franco. However, it is a common misconception that Mussolini was a natural ally of Hitler's after the Nazis seized power in Germany in 1933. In reality, Mussolini was skeptical about the possibility of a German alliance throughout the 1930s. A core issue was the Nazi desire for union with Austria to form a Greater Germany. Italy had long-standing claims on land in the South Tyrol region of Austria, bordering the plain of Lombardy, and this created a rivalry between Italy and Germany over Austria. Throughout the period from 1933 to 1938, during which the Nazis attempted to seize control of Austria through numerous means, Mussolini was supported of the Fatherland Front government in Vienna. It was only gradually from 1937 onwards, once Mussolini needed German support for his actions in the Horn of Africa, and the two began cooperating together in Spain, that an agreement was reached in 1937, whereby Mussolini would not overtly resist German annexation of Austria, provided that Hitler would never make claims on any lands which Italy had obtained from Austria at the end of the First World War. With this agreed, Hitler went ahead and annexed Austria in March 1938. At the Munich Conference, convened in September 1938, over German claims to the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, Mussolini was a subtle ally of Hitler's, though not overtly, still at this stage. In many ways, the growing alliance between Mussolini and Hitler was a strange one. The pair had very different characters. Mussolini was a brash, outspoken and emotive individual, one regularly used to being photographed in his swimming trunks with famous Italian actresses, a practice Hitler ridiculed. Yet for all Hitler's supposedly contrasting seriousness, it was Mussolini who found himself bored by the Austrians' racial rants when they had first met in Venice in 1934. Much of the common view of Mussolini as a buffoon has largely been derived from Nazi impressions of him and the incompetent performance of the Italian military during the Second World War. But this view of Mussolini has been hugely overstated. The Italian dictator was the father of European fascism and had authored multiple books ranging from writings on politics to a biographical study of Jan Hus, the Bohemian religious reformer of the early 15th century, whose work was an antecedent to Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation. Mussolini even penned a romance novel called The Cardinal's Mistress. At the Munich Conference, it was Mussolini who acted as chief translator, being fluent in French and having functional German and English. Mussolini was many things, but the popular view of him as a buffoon or a second-tier dictator with an outlandish desire to restore Italy to the glory days of the Roman Empire is a misconception. He was an intelligent individual, though also an entirely immoral and unscrupulous one. The Munich Conference only created a brief reprieve from war in Europe. 6 months later, the Nazis annexed the remainder of Czechoslovakia. By then, Britain and France were trying to speedily rearm, and when Poland was invaded in the first hours of September 1939, they responded by declaring war on Germany. The Second World War had begun, but Italy would not join it for nearly another year, despite Germany and Italy having agreed to the Pact of Steel, a virtual military and political alliance on the 22nd of May 1939. Mussolini decided to wait and see what happened at this early stage. Encouraged to do so by King Victor Emmanuel III and numerous senior Italian ministers. There were even offers from Paris and London courting Italy as an ally in the war, though Mussolini seems to have never taken them seriously. In the end, when Germany swiftly conquered Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, and Belgium in April and May 1940, and then seemed to be swiftly moving towards seizing control of Paris, Mussolini decided to act. On the 10th of June 1940, he declared war on France and Britain. Italian troops then quickly invaded parts of eastern and southeastern France to secure territory there as part of an arrangement with Hitler. In entering the war, Mussolini's valorizing of the Italian past must be borne in mind, and he now sought to reconstitute a large part of the Mediterranean Empire of the Romans by acquiring territory from France, in the Balkans, Greece, and across North Africa. Designs which he also referred to as the concept of a third and fourth shore, whereby Italy would rule over not just the shores of the western Adriatic and the Tyrrhenian Sea, but also the eastern Adriatic and the central Mediterranean coastline of North Africa. Mussolini and the Italian fascists had already begun their efforts to acquire a third shore in the Balkans even before the Second World War began. While Britain and France were distracted with trying to curb the Nazis' endless demands for lands in Central Europe In 1938 and 1939, Il Duce formed a plan to invade the Kingdom of Albania, just across the Straits of Otranto from southern Italy. On the 7th of April 1939, just weeks after the Germans had taken over Czechoslovakia and the city of Memel on the Baltic Sea coast, Mussolini struck, sending an expeditionary force of over 20,000 men to invade Albania. With modern aircrafts and battleships, the invasion was a complete success, and an Italian protectorate was established in Albania just a week later. London and Paris made few objections, hoping at this juncture that they could still win over Mussolini to join them against the Germans. Now, after the defeat of France in the summer of 1940, Mussolini began preparing for a much more expanded campaign in the Balkans. Greece was invaded late in October 1940, while in the spring the Italians commenced a campaign against Yugoslavia after a pro-Allied coup there. These campaigns would be decidedly less successful than the swift occupation of Albania in April 1939 had been. Before long, Mussolini would have to call on his German allies to lend further support to the Italian divisions in the Balkans. The diversion of German troops and attention to the Balkans in the spring and summer of 1941 are often seen as a contributory factor in the failure of the Germans to take Moscow and Leningrad, before the Russian winters stopped their advance into the Soviet Union later that year. The inadequacies of Mussolini's armed forces were even more strikingly on display in North Africa. Hitler's plan was for the Italians to push eastwards from Libya, to seize Cairo, and then the Suez Canal in Britain's protectorate of Egypt. Then, once the Germans had pushed through Ukraine and into the Caucasus, they would swing south and launch a double-sided attack on the British possessions in the Middle East, where some Arab allies were being courted by the Nazis in Iraq and elsewhere. This would secure both the oil fields of the Caucasus and the Middle East, which, when combined with the capture of the Suez Canal, would leave the British with little option but to negotiate peace terms that would be very favorable to the Axis powers. There was only one problem with this plan. The Italian Royal Army performed abysmally in North Africa following Italy's entry into the war in the summer of 1940. The British, aided by substantial numbers of Commonwealth soldiers from Australia, New Zealand, South Africa and India, pushed the Italians back into Libya and scored a substantial victory at the Battle of Beda Fom in early February 1941. A few days later, Erwin Rommel was appointed to head up the Afrika Korps, a German expeditionary force that had been preparing to head to North Africa for several weeks. This force of just over 30,000 men and a substantial tank brigade would turn the tide back in the favor of the Axis powers, and Egypt was under threat again by the summer of 1941. Still, the necessity of drawing on German aid in both the Balkans and North Africa pointed towards the hollowness of Mussolini's claims regarding Italy being a newly ascendant great power in the Mediterranean. Mussolini was drawing on ever greater amounts of German aid as the war went on. Verti still steered an independent line on many issues. One was the Italian attitude towards the Jewish population of Italy and the territory it had occupied. Mussolini's anti-Semitism did not reach the levels of Hitler and the other Nazi leaders. Instead, Mussolini's racial views tended to focus more on distinctions between white and black people and a concern for what he conceived as falling birth rates amongst the white races. There was no major campaign of persecution against the 50,000 or so Jews who called Italy home under Mussolini in the 1920s and most of the 1930s. A turning point was 1938, as Mussolini drew closer to Hitler and the Nazis. At that juncture, a watered-down Italian version of the German Nuremberg laws were introduced in Italy, ones which removed Italian Jews from government jobs and regulated intermarriage between Jews and non-Jews. It is clear that these measures were not intensely enforced, and that Mussolini had introduced them more to appease the Nazis than anything else. A sign of the fact that Mussolini's regime was not as anti-Semitic as Germany was seen in the movement of many Jews from Nazi-occupied regions in 1940 and 1941 to Italy and Italian-occupied lands. The Holocaust, as we will see, would only really strike Italy once the Germans became the de facto occupying power in the autumn of 1943. By the time the Nazis began implementing the final solution in Europe at the beginning of 1942, events were transpiring in North Africa that would lead to Mussolini's dramatic downfall and then an even more dramatic second act as dictator of Italy. The source of these events lay in North Africa. After the arrival of the Afrika Korps there in 1941, the Italians and the German Expeditionary Force had regained the initiative against the British in the Western Desert, and by the summer of 1942 were threatening to take Cairo and then the Suez Canal again. That was as far as they would get. An injection of British and Commonwealth troops into Egypt turned the tide, and victory at the Second Battle of El Alamein in late October and early November put the Italians and Germans on the defensive. They would never regain the initiative, in large part because, as the fighting at El Alamein was coming to an end, Allied armies were making amphibious landings at key locations along the coast of Morocco and Algeria, two French colonies under Axis control. By the spring of 1943, with the great manpower and resources of the United States coming to bear, the Germans and Italians were corralled into Tunisia, where they were finally defeated in May of that year, bringing the North Africa campaign to an end. Even before victory was achieved in North Africa, plans were well underway amongst the Western Allies to open a second front in Europe to take some pressure off the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe by diverting German resources elsewhere. Winston Churchill wanted this new front to be established in the Balkans, yet eventually the more logical plan was selected. This was to invade the island of Sicily, lying close to the massed Allied forces in Tunisia, and then quickly cross the short distance to southern Italy. What was codenamed as Operation Husky began with an aerial bombardment of Italian positions on the 9th of July 1943, followed by an amphibious assault on the west and south of Sicily on the 10th, during which over 150,000 Allied troops began making landfall. The Sicily campaign would last 6 weeks before the island was fully secured by the Western Allies, succeeding in drawing extensive German resources away from Eastern Europe in the process to shore up the defense of Italy. A 2.5-week reprieve followed before the Allies began the process of transferring hundreds of thousands of soldiers across the Straits of Messina and through the Gulf of Taranto and the Tyrrhenian Sea into southern Italy to begin the conquest of Italy on the 3rd of September. Just over 3 years after entering the war, it was all ending in complete disaster for Mussolini. Even before the conquest of Sicily had been completed, Mussolini had been toppled in Rome. Mussolini was unquestionably the dictator of Italy from 1922 onwards, but he did rule alongside others. The Grand Council of Fascism being the foremost governing body of the regime. It was made up of senior army generals, leading members of the largely ceremonial Italian parliament, and a wide range of ministers and heads of corporate governing bodies. The Grand Council met on the night of the 24th of July, in the midst of the Sicilian campaign, when Mussolini stated that Hitler was considering a strategic withdrawal from southern Italy to form a defensive line against the Allies in the mountains of central Italy. The former Minister for Justice Dino Grandi, whom Mussolini had demoted in February, owing to his criticism of Italian efforts in North Africa, launched a blistering attack on Il Duce. A debate commenced and went on long into the night, with a vote held in the early hours of the 25th of July on whether Mussolini still had the confidence of the council members. He lost this by 19 votes to 8. Mussolini left and attempted to continue as though he was still in charge, believing that the council could not force through the decision. But at a meeting with King Victor Emmanuel III the next day, he was formally relieved of his office and placed under arrest. General Pietro Badoglio was then appointed as the new prime minister. Mussolini was detained for a time in various locations and would soon be taken to the Hotel Campo Imperatore in the Massif of Gran Sasso, in the mountains to the east of Rome in late August. While he was under arrest, the new government of Badoglio was secretly entering into negotiations with the Allies to surrender to them and bring Italy out of the war, now that the devastation of the country and inevitable defeat lay ahead. To the north, Hitler and his generals were more than aware that this was probably occurring and had already developed their own plans for taking over Italy and the Italian armed forces before they could capitulate to the Allies. They would initiate this plan, codenamed Operation Agsa, in early September. On the 3rd of the month, the very day the Allies began landing in southern Italy, the Italian government announced that it had agreed an armistice with the US and British. In response, Operation Agsa was initiated. Hundreds of thousands of Italian troops were requisitioned into the German armed forces by appointing German commanders over their divisions, while German units flooded into northern Italy and began seizing control of large swathes of the peninsula. The Italian government itself eventually left Rome and headed south to join the Allies, while the Germans seized the capital and now prepared to make the Allies fight a bitter battle to secure central Italy. The Battle of Monte Cassino would rage throughout most of the first half of 1944. While Operation Agsa was being carried out, Mussolini was still being held prisoner at the Hotel Campo Imperatore on the Gran Sasso Massif. Hitler and the Nazi High Command were aware that they needed a figurehead to impose control over northern Italy, and also that it needed to be made clear to the leaders of other Axis-aligned countries in Central Europe and the Balkans that if they came into jeopardy, the Germans would support them. Thus, a plan was concocted to rescue Mussolini. On the 12th of September 1943, a small unit of German paratroopers, led by the Special Operations Commander Otto Squazzini, paraglided onto the mountain top near the hotel the former fascist leader was being held in, while a separate team secured the cable cars that led up to the hotel lower down the mountain. They then entered the hotel and rescued Mussolini from the small unit assigned to guard him. A small plane was flown in to airlift Mussolini out. The Gran Sasso raid was so successful that even Churchill remarked on it as an operation of, quote, great daring. Mussolini was now established as the leader of a newly formed Italian Social Republic, the administrative capital of which was fixed at the town of Salo in northern Italy. Daring though it might have been, the Gran Sasso raid effectively made Mussolini a puppet ruler for Hitler in Italy. Upon being rescued from the mountains of central Italy, Mussolini was first flown to Prussia in northern Poland to meet with Hitler at his Wolf's Lair headquarters near Rastenburg. Here it was made clear to him exactly how reduced his position would be. The Nazis were to effectively annex the northeast of Italy into the cumbersomely titled Operational Zone of the Adriatic Littoral, while the fascist independent state of Croatia was granted lands on the eastern side of the Adriatic, south towards Split. Ironically, These were the lands which had been so contentious and led to the idea of a mutilated peace for Italy after the First World War, aiding the rise of the fascists in the first place. Having been humiliated through this stripping away of Italian land, Mussolini returned to Italy. He would reside for the last year and a half of his life at a nice villa on the shores of Lake Garda near Gargnano in northern Italy. He had very little authority over the Italian Social Republic, which he was the nominal head of. Instead, he and his mistress, Clara Petacci, lived here under a form of semi-house arrest, guarded by the SS and having his correspondence screened to ensure he was not in any form of illicit contact with the Allies or the Italian government that had renounced him in the summer of 1943. When interviewed early in 1945, he expressed the view that he was little more than a walking corpse, a puppet for the Nazis waiting to be caught and executed by the Allies. Mussolini would not have to wait much longer for the Allied anvil to fall on him. The Germans and the Allies spent much of the remainder of 1943 consolidating control over their respective positions in northern and southern Italy. The first half of 1944 was then locked in the dual battles of Anzio and Monte Cassino in central Italy, south of Rome, with the Allies finally breaking the deadlock in May. Rome was one of the first major European capitals to be liberated by the Allies on the 4th of June 1944, a full 2 months before the liberation of Warsaw and Paris in August 1944. Thereafter, with a Western Front now opened in France, the strategic priority for the Western Allies shifted away from Italy, although the Allied advance continued at a slower rate into Tuscany and Mussolini's native Emilia-Romagna, while it was now possible to use Rome as a strategic base from which Allied bombing of northern Italy and Austria was initiated. In the interim, the Germans had begun extending the final solution to northern and central Italy, while the substantial communities of Jewish people in Rome, Milan, Genoa, Florence, and Venice had largely avoided persecution under Italian fascist rule. As soon as Operation Axa was implemented in the autumn of 1943, the SS arrived into Italy and began detaining thousands of Italian Jews and deporting them north towards Auschwitz. They were systematically obstructed in their efforts by ordinary Italians, and over 40,000 Italian Jews, over 80% of the total Jewish population in the country, would survive the war. In early April 1945, with the Battle of Berlin commencing far to the north and the Western Allies fanning out all over western, southern and central Germany, Operation Grapeshot was commenced in Italy. This involved hundreds of thousands of Allied troops moving north to try and break through the Gothic Line, a series of German defenses blocking the southern routes into the plain of Lombardy. On the 18th of April, in response to the Allied advance, Mussolini moved from Gargnano to Milan. Unlike many of the German Nazi leaders who would kill themselves before being captured, Mussolini intended to be taken alive and believed that he could negotiate decent terms through the intercession of the Archbishop of Milan, Alfredo Schuster. But a meeting between Schuster and Mussolini a week later failed to result in an agreement after Mussolini resisted a demand by representatives of the Italian communist partisans who had been fighting the Nazis in northern Italy to declare himself in favor of an unconditional surrender to the Allies. Perhaps Mussolini believed he would be murdered by the Germans if he did so. Within hours of the failed meeting, he and his mistress, Clara, along with over a dozen others involved in the government of the Italian Social Republic, had left Milan and were heading north with the goal of reaching neutral Switzerland and from there, possibly finding asylum in Spain, where Franco might look favorably on Mussolini given the aid he had provided the nationalists with during the Spanish Civil War. Il Duce would never make it to Switzerland, let alone Spain. On the 27th of April, he and Petacci were apprehended near Lake Como outside the village of Dongo by some Italian communist partisans. They were placed under arrest while they determined what steps to take. It was well known that Mussolini, like all other Axis leaders and war criminals, was to be handed over to the Allied authorities in order for him to stand trial before the International Military Tribunal that would soon assemble in the city of Nuremberg in Germany once the war ended. The partisans had other ideas. Under the orders of Walter Audizio, a leading Italian communist partisan, Mussolini, Petacci, and the rest of their party were executed before a firing squad on the 28th of April 1945 in the village of Giulino. He was 61 years old at the time. Mussolini and Petacci's corpses, along with other members of the Italian Social Republic's government, Nicola Bombacci and Alessandro Bavellini, were trucked to Milan in the early hours of the 29th of April and hung upside down in the Piazzale Loreto Square in the city, where their corpses were stoned by a crowd. A day later, Hitler killed himself in Berlin, and 2 days after that, German Army Group C surrendered to the Allies in Italy. The war in Europe ended 5 days later. Mussolini's remains had a very unusual after-story. After his corpse was taken down from the gibbet in the Piazzale Loreto, it was buried in an unmarked grave in the Musocco Cemetery in northern Milan. While it was unmarked, enough people knew the location for it to be possible for a fascist sympathizer, Domenico Leccisi, to dig up his remains a year later during Easter of 1946, seemingly with the aid of 2 Franciscan friars. These were then transported around numerous locations in northern Italy in the months that followed, with one of Mussolini's legs being lost along the way. Hiding places included a villa at a convent, as the authorities sought to track down the body. Eventually it was located, and the government chose to have the remains secretly hidden at a rural monastery near Milan. The entire saga only came to an end in 1957, when the government of Prime Minister Adornisoli, who hailed from the same part of Italy as Mussolini, agreed to allow the fascist leader's remains to be interred in the Mussolini family crypt in Dorvia di Predappio. To some extent, Mussolini's shadow would continue to hang over Italy and its politics in the post-war era. Christian Democracy emerged as the most important political party, an organization which had its roots in the Italian People's Party, an entity created in 1919 which had splintered into pro- and anti-fascist factions. For instance, the first post-war Prime Minister of Italy, Alcide de Gasperi, had originally supported the People's Party's involvement in the first Mussolini government in 1922, though he later renounced his support. More broadly, Christian Democracy veered to the right of the political spectrum. The 1970s and 1980s were a particularly tumultuous time in Italian politics, one known as the Years of Lead, and characterized by killings, terrorism, hostage-taking, and general lawlessness by far-right, far-left, and organized crime elements. A political atmosphere which mirrored the chaos of the 1919 to 1922 period that allowed for Mussolini to seize power in the first place. The country has also continued to experience the legacy of the economic problems which characterized Italian politics both prior to and during the fascist era, namely the poverty of southern Italy. Given this seeming inability to fully resolve long-standing economic and political problems, it is unsurprising that recent decades have witnessed a renewed drift towards the far right of the political spectrum in Italy, with some parties being described as neo-fascist. Benito Mussolini was a complex political figure. He was an immensely important individual in the history of 20th century Europe, the father of fascism, or at least the first individual to lead a corporatist and fascist country in modern times. He was also an intellectually capable person, one who wrote numerous books, articulated a vision for Italian society after the tumultuous first 60 years of the Kingdom of Italy, and sought an alternative form of socialism to the communism that was taking root in Russia in his own time. Yet all of this contrasts sharply with other elements of his life and career. Some began to view Mussolini as a trumped-up buffoon over the years, a purveyor of a ridiculous machismo, and a dictator who proved to be an absolute liability as an ally for Hitler and Nazi Germany from 1940 onwards. The Italian army underperformed everywhere it fought against the Allies. It was only when the Africa Corps arrived to North Africa early in 1941, and after the Germans took over the remnants of the Italian army in Italy and the Balkans in the autumn of 1943, that the Allies began to meet stiff resistance on both fronts. In this sense, it was fitting that Mussolini had to be personally rescued from his own people by the Germans in September 1943, and spent the last year and a half of his life as little more than a German puppet ruler. Still, we should not view Mussolini as an insignificant figure. His racial views and capacity for mass murder were nowhere near as extreme as those of Adolf Hitler. But in both his colonial policies in Africa in the 1920s and 1930s, and in tying his mast to that of the Nazis from 1940 onwards, he inflicted an enormous amount of suffering on the lives of many people around the Mediterranean and the Horn of Africa. What do you think of Benito Mussolini? Did he represent a significantly different form of fascism than the Nazis? Or did the actions of Italy in Africa, under his watch, demonstrate that he was just as genocidal as Hitler? Please, let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.